Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The border on the neighboring country's side has a river separating the two countries. On the Thai side, there are many farms and rice fields on the neighboring country's side, which is mountainous and hilly. Back then, development was not as advanced as today. Roads were dirt tracks and electricity was not yet available. At that time, I was about 11 years old. My parents were farmers cultivating land on the neighboring side, which meant I had to cross between the two countries regularly. The story I will tell is about Uncle Sore. I heard it when I was staying at the farm on the neighboring side. Uncle Sore had previously been a soldier for a local indigenous militia. Originally, this militia was part of a larger indigenous military group, but Uncle Sore had separated to join an opposing faction. During that period, the conflict between the opposing forces and the indigenous forces was quite intense. The two groups hated each other deeply and would clash violently whenever they encountered each other. The area where Uncle Sore was stationed was a conflict zone overlapping the territories of both forces. One night, Uncle Sore was on patrol with about 10 soldiers. Their mission was to ambush and attack indigenous forces. At dusk, they heard the sound of two motorized carts approaching their ambush point. Uncle Sore and his team prepared for action. When the carts arrived, they found them filled with villagers, women, children, and the elderly from the Thai side, who had crossed over to work on the neighboring side. When they saw the soldiers, the villagers became frightened and started crying and panicking, and communication was hindered by the language barrier. The soldiers, unable to understand the villagers and believing they might be spies, decided to interrogate them. As the situation escalated, a soldier accidentally struck one of the villagers with the butt of his rifle, causing chaos. Some villagers tried to escape, while others attempted to seize the soldiers' rifles. In a fit of rage and fear, the leader of Uncle Sore's unit ordered the execution of all the villagers. Despite Uncle Sore's protests, the order was carried out, and the bodies were left by the roadside. As time passed and the conflict between the two sides began to ease, rumors about the massacre spread. Locals claimed to hear the ghosts of the victims crying out for help at night, and some reported seeing ghostly figures or hearing eerie noises in the area. Uncle Sore later recounted that his unit was assigned the same ambush mission. On a dark moonless night, they were once again in the dense, pitch-black jungle. Suddenly, they heard strange, rapid movements, which they initially thought were enemies. However, the speed and nature of the movement suggested something non-human. As they tried to identify the source, soldiers began to experience unexplained slaps to their faces, with no visible cause due to the darkness. The commanding officer, frustrated, fired in the direction of the noises, and everything went silent. In the quiet, Uncle Sore heard his comrades gasping for breath. He rushed to find one of his soldiers being straddled by a large, dark shadow, which was strangling him. When Uncle Sore touched the shadow, it felt rough and unnatural. The shadow then spoke, warning him not to interfere. Despite attempts to help, the soldiers could not overcome the shadow until Uncle Sore used a sacred amulet given by a monk. The shadow then fled, leaving only the amulet behind. Uncle Sore ordered everyone to rest as they had to return to their base in the morning. By dawn, what Uncle Sore saw was his friend who had been strangled the previous night. The body lay rigid in a state of shock, eyes wide open, mouth agape, and there were greenish bruises around the neck in the shape of fingers, indicating that the person had been dead for some time. As daylight came, Uncle Sore saw that where his friend had been lying was actually a mound of earth with feet of a corpse sticking out. It was a grave covered with dirt. Driven by curiosity, Uncle Sore's unit leader ordered them to dig up the corpse to see if it was that of a soldier or a civilian. When they dug it up, they found it was the body of a civilian, a woman with a swollen belly, who had been buried alive. After examining the body, they buried it again with the soldiers' bodies. The next event Uncle Sor described was a turning point in his life. During that period, it was the time for a celebratory feast for the opposing soldiers. They were all drinking heavily, stumbling around in drunkenness. Uncle Sor was also drinking, but had not consumed too much. As night fell and the party ended, everyone scattered to sleep, some near the campfire, others on hammocks, while some slept sitting up, still holding their liquor bottles. Uncle Sor woke up with a stomachache and went to relieve himself at the base camp. While doing his business, he heard strange noises, like people choking or gasping, and sometimes sounds of things hitting the ground. He noticed these noises came from their own base, not far away. He sneaked over to investigate and saw over 20 enemy soldiers slaughtering his comrades one by one, without using guns. Uncle Sor was terrified and fled for his life, swimming across to the Thai side. After that, he wandered and worked in Thailand, with his entire unit having been killed except for him. It was as if he had already died, and he never returned to be a soldier or cross back to that side again. This was the whole story. The disciple, you're not ordinary. Next, let me tell you about a story my father recounted. During the massacre, his friends were farmers from the Thai side who had gone to work on the other side and never returned. It was believed that the events my father told me about and Uncle Sor's story might be the same incident. War brings about such horrors, and some people may not want to die, but are caught in a situation where they do not know what awaits them. The story begins in February 2016. Captain Noak mentioned that during that time, the southern region was conducting conscription selection. Soldiers were sent to villages and districts to establish conscription units, commonly known as the draft. The conscripts were to be deployed to the 3 southern border provinces. Captain Noak explained that when setting up a conscription unit in any district in the 3 border provinces, a team of soldiers must first patrol and assess the area's risks. This information was essential for planning and deploying soldiers to establish the unit. Captain Noak received orders from his commander to lead a team to survey an area that would lead to Raman district. This area was mainly forested, with few inhabited houses. The mission required immediate attention due to the high-risk nature of the area. On that evening, Captain Noak and his team set out to survey the area. The weather quickly turned, and heavy rain impaired visibility. The cold and strong winds forced the soldiers riding in the back of the pickup truck to move inside the cab, as they parked by the roadside to let the soldiers get into the cab. A local resident riding a motorbike with a sidecar passed by. The resident stopped to greet Captain Noak and asked what the soldiers were doing. Captain Noak explained that they were there to set up a conscription unit. The locals suggested they shelter from the rain in a nearby village. After discussing with his team, Captain Noak decided to take the locals' advice. They turned into a small road, and, driving for about 700 meters, they reached a fork. Unsure of which way to turn, they decided to go straight ahead based on the locals' earlier instructions. The rain continued to pour heavily as they drove further. Eventually, they spotted a village on both sides of the road. To avoid disturbing the cattle in the left village, they decided to shelter in the village on the right, where there was a small mosque. The soldiers rushed out of the truck to seek shelter under the mosque's roof, forgetting the rule against wearing shoes in such a sacred place. A local man praying inside came out to scold them. Captain Noak immediately apologized and offered to clean the area, but the man simply replied angrily and walked away. As they waited for the rain to stop, an elderly man from the mosque approached them and asked where they were headed. Captain Noak explained their mission, and the man suggested a shorter route. He advised them to turn left at the first crossroads after leaving the village and to continue straight. Taking the man's advice, they followed the new route. However, after driving for about an hour, they found themselves deeper in the forest with nitrogen monoxide signs of a community. The road became increasingly twisted, and it seemed like they were driving in circles. By 8:30 p.m., they still had not found an exit. The road, filled with hairpin turns and long stretches, seemed endless. Captain Noak decided to use the radio to contact their base, hoping for further instructions. This haunting journey through the forest was just the beginning of their terrifying night in the abandoned village on the border. So, he ordered the truck to stop and called all the soldiers to come down and discuss what they should do. Should they turn back the way they came, even if it meant wasting over an hour? It seemed better than continuing forward without knowing what lay ahead, especially if there were terrorists waiting to ambush them. It could make it difficult for them to escape. At that moment, the consensus was that they should turn back. And it seemed that the return journey took less time than it did to get there initially. By around 9 p.m., they reached the intersection where they had first turned in earlier. Major Noak ordered the driver to turn right towards the village where they had taken shelter from the rain earlier in the evening. When they reached the village, they found that no one had any lights on in their homes. Everything was dark, unlike earlier when they had seen cows and bird cages that people had hung up. As the light from the truck shone into the village, they saw that it looked like no one was living there at all. After parking the truck in the village, Major Noak got out and checked his communication equipment. He found that the signal was weak, as indicated by a blinking red light, but it was still possible to communicate with the unit. Seeing the situation was not good, Major Noak radioed the unit for help to get his team out of the area. However, the communication was intermittent and garbled, making it hard to understand. The mobile signal was also very weak. Major Noak figured that the unit would pick up their signal eventually, so he ordered all soldiers to stay put in the village for now. While waiting, Major Noak led some soldiers to explore the village. The atmosphere was very quiet, as if no one actually lived there, even though they had seen people at the mosque earlier and had talked to them. As they explored further into the village, Major Noak noticed out of the corner of his eye that a light from a TV was flickering in one house. He turned to look and said, "Look, there are people here after all." One of the soldiers remarked that the sound from the TV wasn't in the local language. Major Noak led his men closer to the house with the TV light. The house looked like a single-story townhouse made of red brick, with some parts broken and deteriorated. There were 4 steps leading up to the front door. Major Noak decided to go up the steps and greeted the homeowner in the local language, asking for directions as they were lost. A voice responded from inside, asking what they wanted. Major Noak politely asked for directions, explaining they were lost. However, after he finished speaking, there was no response. At that moment, Major Noak thought that maybe the people in the house didn't want to help, so he and his men slowly backed away and continued to explore other houses. They came across a group of 5 to 6 children playing traditional games. Major Noak found it strange because these games usually involve music, but the children were playing in silence. Major Noak approached the children and asked, "Where do you live?" The children pointed towards a house near the mosque without saying a word. Major Noak then led his men towards the house the children pointed to. One of the soldiers remarked to Major Noak that something felt off, but Major Noak told him not to worry and to hurry so they could leave quickly. As they walked towards the house, they encountered an elderly couple. Major Noak greeted them and asked for directions again. The old man told them to go straight and turn left. Major Noak replied that turning left would take them back to where they got lost earlier. But the old man insisted, telling them to turn left and leave quickly. After talking with the old man, Major Noak and his men walked back to the truck and informed the driver that they couldn't get any useful information. The driver suggested they should drive straight out. Everyone agreed, so they got back into the truck and drove straight. After driving for about 20 minutes, Major Noak ordered the driver to turn on the spotlight to increase visibility. Despite this, they couldn't find the main road they had originally turned off from. They remembered that it didn't take this long to reach the village earlier. Major Noak told the driver to turn around and go back to the intersection. When they reached the intersection, he told the driver to turn left and continue straight. Shortly after, they finally found the main road. Relieved, they continued driving for about 20 kilometers until the driver suddenly pulled the truck over to the side and pointed to the left. He signaled for Major Noak to look, indicating a small path leading into a dense forest. Major Noak and two soldiers got out to investigate. Do you believe that this alley they just drove out of onto the main road moments ago? While Captain Noak and his soldiers were still confused by what they saw, a local motorbike passed by. The driver blinked his lights and called out to the local, asking how they could get to Ramen or Thung Yong Deng. The local asked if they were lost, to which Captain Noak replied, "Yes, it's raining and dark. A villager told us to take shelter in the village, and now we can't find our way out." Despite his distrust of the local, fearing they might be misled again, the local instructed them to drive straight ahead without turning, and they would reach Thung Yong Deng. Upon hearing this, Captain Noak asked if they would pass through Ramen. The local confirmed, so Captain Noak and his men continued until they reached a bridge over a mangrove-lined river. Crossing the bridge, they encountered several villages, which reassured them they were on the right path. They followed signs indicating Ramen was just 3 kilometers away and eventually entered Thung Yong Deng around 11:30 p.m. After parking at the district office, Captain Noak got out and saw no one but an administrative officer on duty. Captain Noak approached and explained their route, mentioning the shelter in a village on the left. The shocked, asked how they entered that village and who guided them. He revealed that the village had been abandoned for 40 years. Captain Noak recounted the entire incident, including a local at the mosque who gave them directions. The AO informed them that if they had continued straight, they would have ended up at a cliff. This path was an old rubber tapping route and not a general thoroughfare. Captain Noak still didn't think of ghosts, assuming they had been pranked. His driver remarked that they were deliberately misled into danger. Captain Noak requested additional troops to search the area, and 4 more soldiers joined them. Leaving 5 soldiers at the district office, Captain Noak and his team returned to the village around 1:30 a.m. They found the once passable path now overgrown and impassable. Captain Noak suggested it might be the wrong way, but the driver insisted it was the correct GPS location. They decided to regroup at the district office. The next morning, they shared their story with locals, who confirmed the village was indeed abandoned. After conscription duties, Captain Noak and his team had to pass by the village again to return to Russo. As they packed up, they reached the village entrance around 4 p.m. Captain Noak asked his men if this was the same path they got lost on the previous night. They confirmed, so he contacted his superior, who was surprised there was an uncharted village. He ordered Captain Noak to gather data on all eligible conscripts in the village. The team had to stay and conduct their duties there. By 5 p.m., they set up tents and signs for conscription. 6 soldiers stood guard as Captain Noak discussed with them why the village appeared normal by day, but was eerily silent at night. Around 9 p.m., Captain Noak went to rest, but woke at 1 a.m. to voices. Checking outside, he found his men asleep and wondered whose voices he had heard. A fellow soldier, the driver, confirmed hearing the same sounds for a while. Captain Noak decided to investigate. Walking through the village, they met a group of men drinking tea. The men warned them not to walk around at night due to dangers. As they left, they saw a woman sitting outside a house. Confused about not seeing her before, they approached. The woman gestured for them to enter the house. Inside, a body hung from the ceiling, shocking them. When they looked back, the woman had disappeared. Regaining composure, Captain Noak used a flashlight to signal his men to gather. The driver noted that the woman's face resembled the hanged corpses. Upon regrouping, Captain Noak ordered some soldiers to guard the body, while he and 3 others went to find the men they saw earlier. The sound of footsteps echoed from inside the house. Captain Noak shouted, "If anyone's in there, come out now." Officers are about to enter, but there was no response. Captain Noak then ordered the soldiers to break down the door immediately. Inside, the house was old and cluttered with a strong musty odor. As they moved to the 2nd floor, they found no sign of anyone. What puzzled Captain Noak was the presence of Hindu deity Ganesha and Thai spirit dolls, offerings typically found in Buddhist households. Despite this being a Muslim home, after the soldiers exited the house, they proceeded to inspect the mosque. This time, they remembered to remove their shoes, recalling the scolding from a previous visit. As Captain Noak pushed the mosque door open, they were shocked by the sight. The interior, previously pristine, now appeared old, dilapidated, and filthy. While the soldiers scanned the area with their flashlights, an old man emerged from the shadows, walking towards them. They instinctively stepped back and shouted, "Stop right there! Who are you?" The old man replied, "I've been guarding this place for a long time. What are you doing here?" Captain Noak recognized him as the one who had invited them to take shelter from the rain. Captain Noak asked, "What are you doing here, uncle? How can you live in a village this deserted and run down?" The old man responded coldly, "I invite everyone who passes by to come in." Curious, Captain Noak asked how the old man managed to live there. The old man pointed behind the mosque. They followed his direction and were stunned into silence at the sight of a burial ground. Captain Noak quickly excused himself and led his men out of the mosque. As they left, the old man's voice called out eerily, "If you can leave, then go ahead." The soldiers hastily packed their belongings. When Captain Noak tried to make a call, he found there was no signal, but that wasn't a problem as he knew the route well. They drove out of the abandoned village, but as they approached the intersection, they saw the old man standing there. Captain Noak ordered the driver to stop and confronted the old man, asking, "What do you want?" The old man repeated, "If you can leave, then go ahead." Captain Noak returned to the vehicle and ordered the driver to proceed. They eventually reached the main road and stopped to discuss their eerie encounter. A soldier revealed that he had sensed something was wrong from the beginning, knowing the area was abandoned and historically significant as a site where villagers, including military families, were massacred. Captain Noak reported the incident to his unit, but they dismissed his account as nonsense, believing no such village existed. Determined, Captain Noak led his unit back to investigate. They found human remains in almost every house, confirming the village's tragic history. The discovery made headlines, revealing a forgotten massacre near Raman district in Yala province. Reflecting on Captain Noak's story, it was both chilling and fascinating. The first thing I wondered was why they trusted locals in such a risky area. Soldiers operating in dangerous zones should be cautious. Moreover, why didn't the soldier familiar with the area share his knowledge earlier? Perhaps there were reasons for their decisions. Let's enjoy these stories. Today, we'll talk about a chilling tale, the encounter with a vampire bat deep in the jungle. This story takes place back in 1987. At that time, I was serving as a border patrol soldier. My unit was assigned a mission in the jungle, but we ended up getting lost deep within it and couldn't find our way out for several days. The entire event started on the third evening after our unit had been wandering aimlessly in the dense forest. We decided to set up camp near a small stream that we stumbled upon, a perfect spot to rest. That evening, I felt the need to relieve myself, so I walked about 100 meters away from our camp into the woods to do my business. While I was attending to nature's call, I suddenly heard strange noises from up in the trees. It sounded like two people, a man and a woman, having a conversation above me. At first, I thought it must be some enemies, so I drew my knife and hid, trying to listen carefully. But the more I listened, the less sense it made. I couldn't understand the language they were speaking, but it sounded like a man and a woman chanting some sort of incantation. As I continued to eavesdrop, a leech suddenly bit me on the neck, causing me to jump and step on a dry branch, making a loud crack. The voices stopped immediately. Moments later, some twigs and leaves fell from above. Without hesitation, I pulled out my pistol and fired 5 rounds into the tree above me. As I fired, I heard a woman scream, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing down. In that instant, I saw what appeared to be human legs transform into something resembling the wings of a giant bat. Startled, my comrades rushed over to me, shining their flashlights up the tree where I had been firing. What they saw sent chills down their spines. A giant bat, about 3 meters in size, flying away, 2 of them, to be exact. A few soldiers moved closer to the base of the tree and found dark blood with a foul stench smeared all over the bark. One of the soldiers whispered, "That must have been a vampire bat." I was sure I had hit it with all 5 shots, but it didn't die. We were all silent. I ordered everyone to return to camp immediately. Once back, I called aside the soldier who mentioned the vampire bat and asked him how he knew. He told me that he had encountered such creatures before while trekking deep into the jungle. He explained that they were the result of dark rituals where a shaman would fuse an animal's soul with a human's, creating a powerful and deadly creature, much like the legendary Werediger. These beings were used to eliminate intruders in their territory. I asked him, "How can we know when we've left its territory?" He answered, "I don't know, sir." I thought back to the eerie silence in the jungle, no sounds of wildlife, not even insects chirping. I ordered the men to take turns standing guard throughout the night. At around 2 a.m., I heard the strange noises again, this time much closer, within our camp's vicinity. The full moon was shining brightly that night, and I could see the figure of a woman standing on top of a tree, about 50 meters from our camp. I quickly nudged the sergeant beside me and pointed at the figure. He saw it too, but then the woman's figure suddenly rose into the air, transforming into a monstrous shape before flying away behind the thick trees. I realized we were in serious trouble. I ordered all soldiers to prepare their weapons, then went back to the soldier who knew about the vampire bat. "If we shoot it, will it die?" I asked. "Probably not, sir. It might only be temporarily slowed down," he replied. "Is there any way to kill it?" I pressed. "There is one way, sir. You need to use a bamboo spear dipped in coconut water and pierce it through the heart," he answered after a moment of thought. Hearing this gave me a glimmer of hope. I immediately dispatched some men to cut bamboo and find coconuts. But to our surprise, every coconut we found was dry. Inside there was no water at all. All we could do was sharpen the bamboo sticks and keep them close for protection. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, but nothing happened. As dawn broke, we quickly packed up and tried to find our way out of the jungle. But it seemed like the more we walked, the deeper we went. Our food supplies were running low, and we were all exhausted. As the sun reached its peak, we decided to take a short break. While the others rested, I scouted the area and stumbled upon 2 old men, each carrying a shotgun slung over their shoulders. As soon as they saw us, they headed straight toward our group. My soldiers raised their rifles, ready to fire, but one of the old men shouted, "Hold your fire, we're here to help you out of this forest." As we cautiously navigated through the dense jungle, a sudden voice called out, "Do you realize you've wandered into a forbidden zone?" Startled, I ordered my men to lower their weapons, and I approached the 2 elderly men who had spoken. "Who are you, and how did you find us here, and where exactly are we?" I asked. One of the elders responded, "Did you encounter the ghost bats yet?" I nodded. "Yes, I did. I shot at one 5 times yesterday, but it wasn't affected at all." The old men chuckled. "Ordinary bullets won't harm it. You need bullets made from the bones of 7 different cemeteries. What brings you so deep into this forest?" "We came to guide you out and to deal with that ghost bat," they said. "Where are you from?" I asked. "It doesn't matter where we came from. Just know we're here to help." I then inquired about the ghost bat, asking where it came from and how it got here. The elder explained, "It's a ghost bat from a cursed sorcerer who broke a sacred rule and turned into a demon. The bat possesses people, turning them into its hosts." "How many bats did you see?" "2, I replied. The old man seemed surprised. "You're fortunate to have survived. These ghost bats are more dangerous than even the legendary weretiger." I was anxious to leave the forest, so I asked, How can we get out of here?" The elder replied, "You can't leave until the ghost bat is killed. It has trapped many others here before. Did anyone see its human form?" "I did," I replied. "It was a woman, but I only saw one. The other two I couldn't see. We must hurry and find an open area near a water source to set up camp for tonight," one of the elders suggested. We have nothing to lose by following their advice, I thought. As night fell, the elders placed a sacred string around our camp and began chanting incantations. One of them turned to us and warned, "No matter what happens, do not leave this protected area." I then asked how many ghost bats there were. 3 or 4, the elder replied, "But they have many, forest spirits as their followers. These creatures crave human hearts, and the more they consume, the stronger they become. They've attacked several villages, almost turning them into ghost towns. The forest we were in used to be a hidden land, inhabited by women and mystical beings like Kinnari. The place had been lost to time. The reason you all wandered in is because fate has brought you here. You're all marked by destiny, but you haven't died yet. It's fortunate that we found you first, otherwise, you'd be dead by now." "But how did you manage to enter this forest?" I asked. "We have special skills that allow us to travel in and out of this cursed forest," one elder replied. As we were talking, a sudden, strong wind blew through the area, followed by the eerie sound of a woman's laughter. Looking towards the sound, we saw shadows of creatures, half human and half bat, swooping around. The bats were much larger than the one I had seen before, with wingspans of at least 5 meters. The elder who had been chanting stood up, drew a sacred knife from his bag, and stabbed it into the ground. As soon as the knife touched the earth, we heard a woman scream louder and more terrifying than before. What was even more horrifying was that blood began seeping from the spot where the knife was embedded. My soldiers were paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend the sight before them. The smell of blood was overpowering. The elder then sprinkled holy water on the blood, causing it to evaporate into a black mist. Suddenly, we noticed red eyes glaring at us from all directions. It was the forest spirits. The elder instructed us to gather our bullets, which he then blessed with holy water. He commanded us not to leave the protected area under any circumstances and to shoot anything that moved. Several soldiers, upon seeing the red eyes, began firing wildly. Each shot was followed by agonizing screams echoing through the forest. I was terrified, but the elder kept urging us not to be afraid, insisting that if we survived the night, we would all make it home. As the night wore on, the red eyes gradually disappeared, and the dark shadows that had been darting around slowly faded. However, when I looked up, I saw something even more disturbing. 3 figures standing on top of a distant tree. They were too far away to make out clearly, but the moonlight revealed that one was a woman. The other 2 figures were harder to identify. They might have been men, but I wasn't sure. Suddenly, all 3 figures jumped off the tree and transformed into bats, to smaller ones with 3-meter wingspans and one much larger, with wings stretching at least 5 meters. They flew straight towards us. One of the elders fired a single shot from his pistol at the largest bat, and it let out a chilling, agonized scream before crashing into our protective circle. The other 2 bats retreated, but not before a voice, sounding like multiple people speaking in unison, echoed through the night. "I won't let you go." Then they disappeared into the darkness. After finishing, Pranang grabbed his sacred knife and walked directly to the significant spot. He used the knife to cut open the chest of the fat creature, removing its heart. He then chopped it into pieces, placing them in different parts of the jungle. He buried one part in the east and the other in the west. Afterward, they burned the remains of the bat creature to release the spirits that had been killed by it. Pran then turned to us and said, "You all can rest easy tonight. Tomorrow, we'll perform a ritual to open the forest and send you all home." I ordered my soldiers to rest, but I couldn't help asking the 2 Prans, "Will those vampire bats return tonight?" Pranbo reassured me, "Not tonight, but they will definitely return tomorrow." He also warned us, "Tomorrow, You must leave the forest before sunset. If you don't, you'll all perish here. The two of us won't be able to guide you out because we have unfinished business here. Head east, and whatever happens, do not look back under any circumstances." The next morning, the Prans performed the ritual to open the forest. I then ordered my soldiers to form a line and abandon everything unnecessary. We handed over whatever rations we had left to the two Prans and set off towards the east. I kept reminding everyone, do not look back. We kept marching, one step at a time, resisting the urge to turn around. Finally, we reached a road. Everyone was overjoyed, hugging each other with tears of relief. We waited by the road until a military truck passed by. We flagged it down, and everyone climbed aboard. Upon returning to the base, I reported the incident privately to my superior officer. He asked where our unit had disappeared to for several days. I was shocked by his question because, by my count, it felt like only for 5 days had passed. Then he asked, "Did you meet to old Prans? Is that how you managed to get out?" I was stunned by his words. But there's one thing I still can't be sure of. Were those two old Prans really human?
Hello everyone, the story I will tell today is about an incident that occurred in a forest in Lopburi province. At that time, it seemed that the person in question had to travel to carry out a mission to survey the forest in preparation for training military students. Local villagers had warned them not to enter the forest at that time, but due to disbelief in the villagers' warnings, they ended up encountering strange events, and eventually, a loss occurred in a story titled Not Believing, Yet Following. Music. Before we dive into our eerie story, I'd like to ask all viewers to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring spine-chilling tales. For today, I am presenting the spooky experiences of Sergeant Nook, which he shared on the Ghost Radio program in 2017, in the form of a scary story for all of you to watch and listen to. The story involves events that happened to Sergeant Nook himself during his duty in a certain forest. I must say beforehand that this story involves a loss, so I want to express my condolences to the family of the deceased in this incident. Let's go back to around 2010, when Sergeant Nook was tasked with training commando students in Lopburi province. This course was a field training where Sergeant Nook was responsible for overseeing the entire training. Military students would be divided into groups of 40, and the training required these students to be left in the forest and use their skills to survive and get out within a specified time, which was about 2 days. If they could not exit the forest within 2 days, they would be considered to have failed the commando training. Before the departure day, Sergeant Nook and the other trainers, about 3 people, went to contact the local villagers to use the forest area for training. This forest was near the villagers' agricultural land, and it was state-owned land allowing villagers to farm. Sergeant Nook explained the details of the training to the villagers, mentioning that they could not specify the exact duration of the training. However, the course required students to survive in the forest within 48 hours. The villagers advised Sergeant Nook and his team not to conduct the training in the forest at this time. Sergeant Nook then asked why, considering they had conducted similar training every year in the past. The villagers explained that they didn't want the training to occur now because it was the end of the rainy season and the beginning of the cool season. Normally, no one ventured into the forest at that time. One villager, who had previously worked as a guide into the forest, emphasized that during this period, the forest would be dense and unmanageable, and no one would be able to guide them up the mountain. Upon hearing this, Sergeant Nook suggested that instead of letting the students hike up, they could use helicopters to drop the students at the designated location and then descend from the forest to check if it was safe. If they could safely come down, the villagers would have to guide the trainers up to the students. The villagers agreed to this proposal. After understanding the situation, Sergeant Nook went to find soldiers in Lopburi to see if anyone had previously used the designated drop-off point for training. A soldier from 2 years prior confirmed that he had used this area for training and volunteered to guide them. On the day of departure, around 9 a.m., everyone gathered at the base of the mountain. The team for the reconnaissance included Sergeant Nook and 2 sergeants. They traveled by helicopter to the drop-off point, which took about half an hour. When they arrived at the destination on the mountain, it was around 9 a.m. They began surveying the area, starting with the drop-off point to check if it was suitable and safe. They spent the whole day surveying the surroundings. By around 5 p.m., they started testing if there were any dangerous animals or hazards in the forest. At night, as the villagers had feared, they set up camp and lived like the students would during the training to see if they could survive. That night, Sergeant Nook and the two sergeants slept in separate tents. Around 8 p.m., they discussed that there shouldn't be any issues and agreed to split up the next day to hike down the mountain, meeting again at the base. They talked until around 9 p.m. The atmosphere at the top of the mountain was very quiet. Suddenly, they heard a distant sound carried by the wind, resembling a festival noise. Sergeant Nook remarked to his colleagues that if there was a festival, they were too far away for the sound to reach them. One sergeant added that the area they surveyed had no nearby villages. They chose this location specifically to avoid training near communities to prevent students from seeking help from locals. After hearing the strange noise, they decided to climb higher to get a better view. They ascended about 1 kilometer, and soon the noise disappeared. The only sound left was their own heavy breathing. They were puzzled because if there was indeed a festival or entertainment nearby, they should have seen lights or something from the highest point on the mountain. It was indeed like that, but now they didn't see or hear anything at all. Feeling uneasy, Sergeant Nook and the team decided to walk down to the campsite. The three of them turned around and walked back along the same path amidst the absolute silence of the forest, which was so quiet that they could hear their own breathing. The weather at that time was not worth mentioning. It was so cold that it made their arm hairs stand up like thorns. As everyone slowly walked back to their campsite, Sergeant Nook mentioned that they hadn't counted each other, but had been using glances to check. Then one sergeant, whom I'll refer to as Sergeant K, spoke up amidst the silence, asking if they were all three present or if someone was missing. Upon hearing this, Sergeant Nook quickly warned him not to speak like that in the forest. Such things aren't said here. After that, another sergeant whispered to Sergeant Nook that he felt like someone was following them. Sergeant Nook replied that he also heard a similar sound of footsteps, but wasn't sure if he heard it for real. The sound they heard seemed like someone walking on twigs, making a crunching noise from behind them. When the group of Sergeant Nook stopped walking, it seemed like the sound stopped as well. At that moment, no one thought of ghosts. They just wondered if there were animals or something following them. They decided to continue walking quietly, each step mindful of whether the strange sound would occur again. Sergeant Nook said that as they started walking again, the mysterious footsteps did indeed resume, sounding like someone walking barefoot on twigs, clearly different from their own footsteps since they were all wearing shoes. When they reached the campsite, everyone remained silent and quickly went to rest. Around 2 a.m., after everyone had fallen asleep, Sergeant Nook woke up because he heard what sounded like a group of people walking around their campsite. The footsteps were the same as the ones they heard while walking down the hill. Sergeant Nook, who was already inclined to believe in the supernatural, suspected that the group of people he saw was not human. He remained still in his sleeping bag while the group seemed to be moving closer and closer to their sleeping area. When the shadows cast by the campfire fell on his sleeping bag, Sergeant Nook decided to get up, gritting his teeth, and when he looked around, the group of people he had seen earlier was no longer there. Not long after, one of the people who had been sleeping got up and came out of the tent to tell Sergeant Nook that he had also heard strange noises since midnight, leading them to decide not to sleep anymore for fear of losing their nerve. They decided to sit and talk instead. At that time, one of the sergeants shared that he had heard a sound like someone kicking the tent stakes, and speculated that the noise could not be from an animal because, instinctively, animals would not come near a campfire. Upon hearing this, Sergeant Nook immediately suggested that they might be encountering what the locals had warned about before, which led Sergeant K to challenge the situation, saying there was nothing to be afraid of and that he would handle it. After Sergeant K's challenge, a senior sergeant advised caution, reminding them that they were in the forest, not at home, and warned them that there might be things they were not aware of. Sergeant Nook then confessed that he had forgotten to perform the ritual to enter the forest and had not brought any ceremonial items for the forest spirits. They agreed to perform the ritual the next morning by catching fish to offer as a ceremonial offering, as Sergeant Nook thought that requesting assistance from the unit would make it feel less like a real training experience. Instead, they decided to catch fish as agreed. The next morning, they caught around 6-7 fish, which were then offered as a ceremonial offering. However, Sergeant K seemed to be skeptical about these matters and said that it was unnecessary and that they should just hurry up and leave. After completing the ritual, they quickly packed their things to descend the mountain. planning to split into 3 separate paths as agreed. When they reached the meeting point after separating for a while, it was around 5 o'clock p.m. Sergeant Nook realized they would not make it to the base of the mountain by then and requested an extra day for the survey. The unit had no problem with this and even emphasized that they should conduct a thorough investigation. Sergeant Nook requested an additional 2-3 days to ensure nothing would happen to the trainees. As night fell, at around 6 o'clock p.m., Sergeant Nook built a fire and set up his hammock as usual, while performing a ritual to ask for permission from the local spirits. Around 2 o'clock a.m., after everyone had gone to sleep, there was suddenly a sound of footsteps, similar to the night before, but this time coming from the direction Sergeant Nook had descended from earlier that day. Then, someone's voice was heard saying, "I'm burning me." Hearing this, Sergeant Nook shouted, asking what was burning, thinking it was one of the sergeants speaking. When he looked out of his hammock, he saw Sergeant K waving and shaking his head to signal that he had not spoken. Sergeant Nook decided to lie down again. After a while, Sergeant Nook was startled awake by some noises and saw Sergeant K getting up because he needed to relieve himself. Sergeant K went to a large tree which Sergeant Nook didn't notice during the day to do his business. After Sergeant K finished, he returned to his tent. About an hour later, Sergeant K suddenly jumped up in his tent, causing the tent to collapse onto the ground. Seeing this, Sergeant Nook asked what happened. Sergeant K then explained that he had a dream where someone pointed at him and asked why he urinated at the sacred tree, which had been protected for hundreds of years. The voice in the dream threatened to follow him no matter where he went, in any realm or life. Sergeant K recounted this with fear, prompting Sergeant Nook to calm him down and ask where he had urinated. When Sergeant Nook checked the spot, he saw that it was a large chandra tree and found offerings and broken figurines placed around it. Sergeant Nook deduced that it was a shrine set up by local people who farmed and fished in that area. Sergeant Nook took Sergeant K to apologize before returning to sleep. After some time, while Sergeant Nook was asleep, the rope tying his hammock to the tree slipped down to the ground, even though he had tied it tightly. The tents of the other 2 sergeants seemed to have their pegs pulled out. Sergeant K grabbed his ritual knife and stuck it into the ground, declaring that no one should disturb the soldiers' area. But surprisingly, the knife couldn't penetrate the ground, which was not hard. Seeing the situation, Sergeant Nook decided to act. It's better to make a proper apology because doing this is challenging his authority. After that, no one dared to close their eyes and they agreed that they would hurry down the mountain the next day, thinking they might not survive. The next morning, everyone set out to leave the forest, but due to the considerable distance, they only managed to get to the foothills. At that point, everyone decided not to radio for help as they thought they had reached the foothills and it was unlikely there would be any further concerns. They then set up camp and spent the night at the foothills. In the evening, after setting up their camp, they went fishing in a nearby water source and cooked the fish they caught for dinner. According to Jacko, while he was scaling the fish, he heard a sound coming from the fish that resembled a human's moan of pain. Shocked by this, he threw the fish back into the water. Jacko then suggested that they should go back because he thought things might be getting worse. However, due to Sergeant Jacko's pride, he insisted on staying until they completed the survey. After dinner and completing their personal tasks, everyone went to bed as usual. Around 10 o'clock p.m., an unusual silence fell, with no sounds of animals or insects at all. Around 2 o'clock a.m., Sergeant Nook woke up to change the guard and let the previous guard sleep in the tent. He noticed that Jacko's tent zipper was open and upon checking, found that no one was inside the tent. Sergeant Nook decided to report this to the other sergeant who had just changed shifts. Both of them then began searching for Jacko using flashlights. Due to the darkness of the area, they could see nothing. They called out Jacko's name, but unlike usual, the echoed response was from an elderly person saying, "I am with you." The voice was very loud. Hearing this, Sergeant Nook and the others were startled and radioed for help. The unit replied that they would come immediately as the location was not far from them. At that time, the unit asked Sergeant Nook if they had sent people to search for his group. Sergeant Nook was surprised and asked why. The unit informed him that during their previous helicopter drop-off, they had seen Jacko with no shadow, while Sergeant Nook and the other sergeant had normal shadows. Sergeant Nook replied that they had not yet seen any additional units sent to them. He and the other sergeant returned to their tent and lit a fire, leaving a note saying to wait at that spot in case Jacko returned and saw the note. While Sergeant Nook and the other sergeant were searching, They walked to the water source where they had previously fished and found boot prints leading into the water. The other sergeant said it was likely boot prints rather than combat boots. Sergeant Nook noted that combat boot prints and boot prints were quite similar. They discussed whether to investigate further, but decided it was too dark and returned to the tent to wait for reinforcements. After a short time, Sergeant Nook saw a group of 7 to 8 people walking past the edge of the forest. They thought this might be the reinforcements, so they signaled and called out. However, the group walked past them as if they did not hear them. Sergeant Nook decided to fire his gun into the air, but the group continued walking as if they did not hear the shots. At that moment, Sergeant Nook was uncertain if they were indeed reinforcements due to the dark environment and only saw the group's flashlight beams. It was unlikely they were locals, since no villagers would walk into the forest at that time. Sergeant Nook and the others returned to their tent and were again puzzled when they suddenly lost all radio signals, even though they had been in contact with the unit before. Sergeant Nook decided to investigate the water source again, leaving the other sergeant at the tent. Upon arriving at the water source, he looked back and saw the shadow of Jacko walking away with an old man dressed in white, resembling a Brahmin. They both disappeared into the trees. Sergeant Nook thought it might be a hallucination caused by fear and continued to the water source. There, he saw what he thought were combat boot prints and a knife similar to one Jacko had previously. He picked up the knife to show the other sergeant when he returned to the tent. Upon reaching the tent and telling the other sergeant about the knife, they decided to return to the water source. However, when they arrived, the footprints were no longer there. They decided to wait at the water source, confident that Jacko might have gone into the water. By around 6 o'clock a.m., the first light of day hit the forest, and Sergeant Nook noticed a military shirt floating on the water. This made him more certain it was Jacko's shirt. Fortunately, the group he had seen the night before returned, and it turned out they were soldiers sent to help. Sergeant Nook asked them why they had not responded to the call. The soldiers said they had not heard anything, and even the campfire they passed was not visible. When they reached the spot where Sergeant Nook's group had stayed, they decided to return when they saw no one there and met Sergeant Nook. Sergeant Nook informed the rescue team about Jacko's traces leading into the water. They searched for Jacko for about 2 hours but could not find him. Sergeant Nook decided to borrow a vehicle from the rescue team to drive to a village they had contacted before entering the forest, about 7 kilometers away, and asked the other soldiers to wait at the water source. Upon reaching the village, Sergeant Nook explained the situation to a hunter, who advised him that he had warned against going into the forest. The hunter mentioned that during the forest closure period, spirits and ghosts were abundant, and they should not have gone fishing or cutting branches as it could disturb the spirits. Sergeant Nook requested the hunter to accompany him back into the forest. Upon reaching a point where the vehicle could not go further, they continued on foot to the water source. The hunter then told Sergeant Nook that there was nothing left. This statement startled Sergeant Nook, and the hunter suggested that it might be too late. When they arrived at the water source, they learned from the divers that Jacko's body was found submerged. The hunter added that he had advised against entering the forest from the beginning and recommended waiting instead of training at that time. He noted that late November was a time of transition from rainy to cold season, making it a period when the forest was closed. If they had trained in April, there would have been no problem. All the soldiers at the site agreed to inform Jacko's family and request a ritual to invite his spirit back. The hunter concluded with a statement about the significance of respecting such warnings. People said that there was no need for the ceremony here. You won't go anywhere. Do you know where he is? Even though he died in the water, we still don't know where he was taken. We must go to the place where this incident began to perform the ritual. That morning's events made everyone anxious. They had to take the hunter, the monks, and others involved to the water source where they used to fish, which was about 1 kilometer away from the incident site. However, the hunter said this might not be the place, so they had to hike up the mountain. Eventually, it became nighttime again. This time, there were many people, and they set up a watch shift. After setting up camp, in the middle of the night, the hunter suddenly woke everyone up, telling them to leave immediately and not stay there, even though it would soon be dawn. Everyone had to rub their sleepy eyes and quickly leave the place. While they were leaving, the hunter explained that there was a sound of people walking around the area where they were sleeping, which was the same thing that Nook's group had encountered earlier. Nook explained to the hunter that they had entered the forest just to train, not with any malicious intent. At that moment, The hunter said they had to resolve the issue at the source. They walked up the mountain to the tree where the hunter had urinated before. The hunter then said that this was the sacred tree of the village, and asked if they didn't know. The hunter set up offerings for the ritual and prayed that if what had happened required a life, they hoped the spirit would be released and not be trapped there. After calling out the name, the hunter asked the spirit to follow the thread and then walk down the mountain with the monks, who held the thread tied to the tree. As they reached the foot of the mountain, it was nighttime again. The hunter said they could not leave the forest yet and needed to perform a ritual to open the forest and apologize. Otherwise, there could be future problems. Everyone reluctantly had to stay another night in the forest. In the middle of the night, one of the soldiers suddenly sat up and spoke in a firm tone, saying, "You will never get out of here as long as I haven't cleared the way for you. I will take you one by one." After hearing this, the monk preached to the entity possessing the soldier. Once the monk finished preaching, the soldier's body sat down and bowed to apologize. The monk then said that since the soldier was like this, he should be allowed to return home. Suddenly, the soldier regained his consciousness. When the situation calmed down, the monk went back to sleep. The next morning, everyone safely exited the forest, and the relatives of the deceased came to retrieve the body for religious rites. The sounds Nook's group heard earlier were a warning that they should not have stayed there. Everyone chose to continue with their task, leading to the events described earlier. After listening to Nook's story, it is another tale that feels exciting with the events that occurred, even though some parts may seem illogical. However, that's the nature of these stories. There is no need to search for answers. If these events happen in reality, I deeply sympathize with the relatives of the deceased.
I told you already I wouldn't bore you with most of the details of my time in Vietnam. I also won't ever refer to it as Nam. As I found after returning home, it's the rear echelon assholes who spent the war pencil pushing who most like to put on a husky voice and say Nam in some deep and mournful way. The short story is, after the incident in the tunnels west of Da Nang, Benoit and I were a little messed up. So, we were useless for tunnel work. Both of us were transferred into two separate regular platoons in the mechanized infantry. About a month after that, I was on a search and destroy mission when a rookie stepped over a VC tripwire. The tripwire was connected to one of our own captured claymores. The claymore blew the rookie's legs off and lodged a bunch of metal and bone fragments in the side of my torso. I survived, and for my trouble I got a ticket home. Well, I say home, but I got a ticket to a military hospital called Camp Zama in Japan. They managed to pull most of the bits of shrapnel out of my torso over to operations. The hospital was dangerously overcrowded. At night the screaming of the other patients was horrendous, and the stench reminded me of that fucking tunnel. I was actually happy when, due to overcrowding, I was transferred to a much older building in the complex. It was some type of disused asylum ward, a total wreck. It only had maybe 15 patients, mostly guys with minor injuries. But I didn't care. It was far enough away from the main buildings that I didn't have to hear the poor bastards screaming for their mothers every night. I was on the mend, which was a blessing and a curse. My tour wasn't up, and if I was declared fit to serve, I might be sent back to Vietnam. And I wasn't going back. Not after what I saw in that tunnel. Two American military doctors and a female Japanese nurse arrived to assess my situation late one evening. "Your injuries seem to be healing quite well," said one stern-faced doctor. "Physically at least," said the second doctor, who wore narrow glasses. The first doctor gave him a look that could cut glass. The doctor wearing the glasses was clearly the psychiatrist. He would have to be my ticket home. If I could convince him I had lost my mind, but I couldn't overplay my hand. The nurse just stood behind them diligently taking notes. "How is your emotional state? Have you had any troubling thoughts? I understand you were a tunnel commando," probed the psychiatrist. "Yes. I sometimes have nightmares about the things I saw in the tunnels. I sometimes think about harming myself." I put a quiver into my voice to add to the effect, but neither of them were buying it. I've never been a good liar. How fucked up a situation was this, that after the shit I saw I needed to fake being mentally unstable just to get a ticket home. I was despondent and I dropped the act. Much as I wanted to go home, I couldn't tell them about what happened in the tunnels. I wanted to go home, but not to be thrown in a mental asylum. What kind of things did you see in the tunnels? The psychiatrist asked calmly. Doc, near dawning I went down into the deepest, darkest tunnel you can imagine. And if I told you what I saw in that tunnel, you wouldn't believe me anyway. So just write whatever you need to on your clipboards and leave me be. The stern-faced doctor was unimpressed with my tone, but as I was speaking, the Japanese nurse stopped taking notes. Her face went deathly pale, and she stared at me with a look of terror on her face. Well, we'll check on you again tomorrow. Try to get some rest, said the psychiatrist, who had a curious look on his face. And with that they all shuffled off. The nurse stared back at me as they went, her face still pale with fear. I went to sleep that night knowing that soon they would send me back to Vietnam. I awoke late that night to the whispering voice of a woman. I couldn't hear where it was coming from. I got out of bed and walked uneasily, rolling my drip along with me. The woman's voice was coming from the next corridor. It must be that nurse, I thought, but the voice sounded all too familiar. I wasn't going walking the halls without a weapon. I searched the unmanned nurse's station. I found a scalpel in one of the drawers. It would have to do. I shuffled through the large wooden doors leading to the next corridor. The light bulbs flickered in the dimly lit corridor. The paint was peeling off the walls. Far to the end of the corridor, I could see the shape of a woman standing near a window looking out into the night. I shuffled toward her with the scalpel leading the way, rolling my drip with my left hand. As I approached, the faint whispers became louder, and I could finally make out the words, "Defiler, come to the red house," it whispered. My drip caught in a cracked tile on the floor, making an awful clanking sound. The woman turned and moved quickly toward me. My heart raced in terror. I prepared the scalpel. You shouldn't be out of bed. It was the nurse, a lit cigarette in her hand. She must have been smoking by the window. Her English was near perfect. She must have been the daughter of an American G. Many of them married Japanese women after the Second World War ended. Why were you whispering to me? I asked, still pointing the scalpel. I wasn't whispering, she said, confused and frightened. You were whispering. You called me ... defiler. What does that mean? I demanded, my hand clutching the scalpel. Once again her face took on the same pale, terrified look. The cigarette dropped from her hand. You're not safe here in Japan, or back in Vietnam. They'll be looking for you. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Who ... Who'll be looking for me? I implored her. I don't know what they call themselves. Every place has a different name for them. The silent plague is the translation of what we call them here in Japan. All I know for certain is, they will be looking for you. Maybe you will be safe if you get back to America. Her words offered little comfort. You have to help me. You have to convince the doctors that I'm crazy, I said to her, almost begging. I will try. Give me the scalpel, she said calmly. I handed her the scalpel, and as quick as I had handed it to her, she slashed it across my arm. I roared out in pain. She dropped the scalpel and grabbed my hand, putting pressure on the wound. This is the only way, she said. I instantly realized her plan. Two orderlies came rushing into the old corridor from an adjoining corridor, alerted by my screams. Get me some bandages. He's trying to kill himself, she roared at the men. One of the orderlies ran for bandages. The other ran over to support me. I slunk down into the orderly's arms, more from pageantry than blood loss. The wound wasn't that deep. I had suffered much worse before. She had done a good job. I was put back in bed and stitched up. The next night I was visited by the psychiatrist. He was alone. He looked at me coldly, noted something on my chart, and asked, "Have you been hearing voices or ... whispers?" No, I replied quickly. It's funny. We had a young soldier from Louisiana in here about 3 weeks before you arrived. He was also a tunnel commando. He claimed he was hearing whispers, but he could never tell me what they said. We had to send the poor fellow home. The psychiatrist maintained his usual cold, clinical composure, but his eyes seemed to burn with a fanatic rage. If you did hear whispers, and they told you something, a secret maybe, you would tell me, wouldn't you? I'm not hearing any voices or whispers. I responded with as much resolve as I could muster. The rage slowly faded from his eyes. "You are being transferred to a hospital in the U.S. You'll be assigned a psychiatrist there," he said before pausing. "I hope when you get home, you will find whatever it is in life you are searching for." And with that he smiled and walked away. He knew I was lying to him. That very night, I was driven to the airport and pushed in a wheelchair into a C-130 by an MP. The flight was filled with men who were broken physically or mentally, and most probably a few guys like me, just desperate not to go back to Vietnam. But unlike them, I was actually hearing voices, but I wasn't crazy. The flight took off. I breathed a sigh of relief. I removed my dog tags, praying I would never need them again. I opened the zipper on my bag to put the dog tags inside, and there staring back at me was a small crudely made clay replica of the golden statue I had seen in the tunnels. "So, what happened when you got home?" I hear you ask. Well, for a while very little. I was kept in the hospital for about 3 weeks. The new psychiatrist seemed swamped with work and saw I wasn't really a danger to myself or others, and so I was discharged. I tried finding Benoit as soon as I could, but he had gone off the grid, as they might say these days. But, in truth, disappearing back then was as simple as not listing your name in the damn phone book. Despite living in the guy's pocket for 8 months of my life, I knew very little about him. I knew he was from a couple of hours west of New Orleans, and he had a sister named Marie. Not exactly solid facts to track a man down by. Soon I gave up trying. I just decided to try and forget about everything. Vietnam, the tunnel, the woman's voice, but the damn statue was always there as a constant reminder. I kept it wrapped in cloth, afraid to touch the damn thing. Eventually I did what every other person in New York did with something they wanted to get rid of. I threw it in the East River. It would find good company down there with all the discarded mob weapons and photos of ex-girlfriends. I had a small amount of money coming in from my veteran disability payments. I topped this up by working odd jobs, when I could find the work, that is. New York in 1969 wasn't exactly a fun place to be. The city stank from uncollected garbage, and there seemed to be a strike or a riot every other day. The teachers, the sanitation workers, hell, it got so bad even the gays started rioting. And they always seemed a peaceful bunch to me. I lived down near Greenwich Village, so I was right in the middle of the mess. Crime was also a huge problem, and I rarely left the apartment without my pistol. And that's how it went for about 6 months. I worked a little and tried to avoid getting shot or stabbed. Then one night out of the blue the phone rang. I generally only got calls from cold call companies. It was a relatively new thing back then, and every asshole outfit with a phone was trying to sell their crap. I picked up the phone. "I don't want to buy radiators, life assurance, or mortgage protection, so go fuck yourself," I calmly said. There was a tiny pause. "It's feely Benoit. I see you haven't lost your way with words," came the response. "Benoit. Jesus, I tried tracking you down when I got back from Vietnam. I couldn't find a trace of you. Where the hell have you been?" "New Orleans." "Look, I don't want to say too much over the phone, but I received a very strange package in the mail. Turns out someone was able to track me down." My heart sank with the news. I didn't need to ask what was in the package. I could guess. "Can you come down to New Orleans? I could offer you work and a place to crash if you need it. Do you have anything pressing keeping you in New York?" I looked out the window. I listened to Benoit on the phone. Tonight PD officers were beating the ever-loving shit out of some guy with batons. A small group nearby were raining bottles at them. "Yeah, I could do with getting out of New York for a while. I could be there in a few days," I replied. Benoit filled me in on the details of where to meet. He didn't want to talk on the phone, as if he thought someone might be listening. The next morning I threw what little possessions I had into my old beaten-up Impala and hit the road. I didn't bother giving notice to the landlord of my flea-bag apartment. You might think me mad for taking the trip to New Orleans. I suppose I could have just hung up the phone and forgot about Benoit and the things we saw. But that's just not me. He needed my help. We had been through hell together in Vietnam, and I don't mean that figuratively. I mean I felt we had literally descended into some kind of hell in that tunnel. I wasn't about to leave the guy to deal with this shit alone. It felt good to get out of New York. The journey was long and the summer was sweltering. I drove relentlessly, wanting to get to New Orleans as quickly as possible. I avoided the big cities and only stopped to sleep. On the last night of the journey, I stopped at a cheap motel near a one-horse town about an hour past Birmingham. The reception building was small. The desk was manned by a middle-aged man. I guessed he was the owner on account of there being a photo of him in uniform as a younger man on the wall. It looked like it was taken somewhere in Europe during the Second World War. You look a little worse for wear. Long journey. Where are you headed to? The owner made small talk as he handed me my key. Houston, I lied as I fumbled with my things. I'm not fully sure why I lied. It's not like whoever these people with the statues where they could manage to staff every shithole hotel between New York and New Orleans with staff. On the off chance I passed through. I was so exhausted that night I fell asleep fully clothed as soon as my head hit the pillow. I awoke in a sweat to the whispers of a woman. It was still night out. I took my pistol from my bag and tucked it into the back of my jeans. I left the room and followed the voice, the same phrase over and over. Defiler, come to the Red House. I walked down the steps to ground level. The voice became louder as I approached a soda machine at the corner of the motel. A light on top glowed red in the night. Defiler, almost like it was inside my head. I'm not a fucking defiler. I mumbled back to no one. What was that, honey? You want to defile me? Well, that's gonna cost ya. Usually my customers don't put it in that kind of eloquent language. She laughed. It was a whore, a well-dressed one at that, a little too well-dressed and refined for this motel. She was leaning near the illuminated soda machine. Sorry, I was just talking to myself, I replied. The whispers had stopped. You looking for a date? She casually inquired. No, I'm fine thanks. Just came to get a soda. I quickly responded. You sure? It's a long way to New Orleans. I could help you relax, she said, licking her lips. My mind froze with fear, but I kept my composure. I'm headed to Houston, I calmly responded. Funny, the owner said you were on your way to New Orleans. She dryly retorted. Well, the owner's mistaken, I replied, matching her tone. That's what I told him when he said you were headed to Houston. It took some of my charm to persuade him, but he finally told me you had a map that showed a route to New Orleans when you checked in. I said nothing in response. Sadly, what he couldn't tell me was where you were headed once you got to New Orleans. Yeah, well, maybe your charm isn't as persuasive as you think, I responded. All the while I was considering taking out my pistol and putting it to her head. She tilted her head forward a little. Her face glowed a fiery red under the light of the soda machine. She bared her teeth and her eyes took on the same look of fanatic rage I had seen in the psychiatrist's eyes at the hospital. Oh, you have no idea how persuasive I can be. She spat with unrestrained rage. I reached for my pistol, but she slipped around the corner and ran into the black of night. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, she said, laughing from somewhere deep in the darkness. Running out after her into the night would be a fool's errand. I ran in a panic to the motel reception building. Maybe she had divulged some tiny piece of information to the owner. I could be persuasive too. Broken ribs usually jog people's memory. Maybe he wouldn't have any information, but either way I was going to sternly educate him on the perils of spilling your guts to strange women who offer free. The small reception building was dimly lit. There was no one behind the desk. I rang the bell but got no response. Impatiently I walked behind the counter. I opened the back office door. As I opened the door, the metallic smell of fresh blood hit my nostrils. I covered my nose. The owner lay dead on his back. His mouth was duct taped shut. Two glass shards had been rammed into his eye sockets. Tough bastard. I didn't give him enough credit. He wasn't falling for her hooker routine, so she had to torture him for what little information he had. Or maybe it was just to send me a message. I wasn't hanging around for the cops. Maybe this was a setup. Either way, I wasn't sticking around. I wiped down the office doorknob with my sleeve. My fingerprints being anywhere else in the building could be explained, but not on the back office door. I walked to my room with as much outward calm as I could muster. I packed my things and got in my car. I drove out into the night. With luck, I'd make it to New Orleans by morning. I knew one thing for certain. These people, whoever they were, wanted that voice to keep whispering to me. They wanted to know where it was leading me. That was the only reason I was still alive. As soon as they figured that it might be less trouble to torture me rather than just follow me, I'd end up like the owner of the motel. The pistol was digging into my back, so I took it from my jeans and opened the glove compartment to put it inside. As the glove compartment opened, a small clay statuette fell out. I didn't need to look at it. I already knew what it was. I put the pistol away and kept driving. Safety in numbers, I thought, as I sped toward New Orleans. Benoit would have a plan. He always did. I barreled my way through the night, praying the engine of my old Impala wouldn't give up the ghost from the hard ride. Day was breaking as I crossed Lake Pontchartrain. It glowed yellow with the rising sun, but in truth it was a cesspool brown the closer I got to the city. Benoit had just told me to get to the French Quarter and call a phone number when I got there. The French Quarter wasn't quite the tourist mecca it is today, but it was still popular, especially with service members on shore leave looking for cheap thrills. It was seedy as hell. But a city like that can be a blessing in disguise for men in my situation. Seedy cities are easy to disappear in if needed, and there's usually some unscrupulous ex-service member willing to sell you some extra firepower. And who was I to judge an unscrupulous man? I had just fled a fucking murder scene. I parked the car near a payphone and got out. I fumbled with some change and dialed the number Benoit had given me. The phone rang for what felt like a lifetime, then someone picked up. "It's me. I'm here," I said, not giving any other details. "Good to hear your voice. I thought something might have happened to you on the road," came Benoit's relieved response. "Yeah, well, something did happen to me on the road. I'll fill you in when I see you," I replied while looking around the street through the dirty glass. Benoit gave me an address a couple of blocks away. He didn't say anything else over the phone. I drove the car over to the address. It was on a quiet side street. When I arrived at the address, I thought I must have been mistaken. It was a small, weird store, not an apartment building. Marie's General Goods and Supplies. Strangest general goods store I had ever seen. Black drapes covered the windows, and there wasn't much sign of life. I pushed the door with apprehension. A small bell rang, and I was hit by the smell of burning herbs. I walked into the store. It was filled with antiques, and what I would refer to as voodoo shit, although I never quite grasped the difference between voodoo, and all those other African religions. "You made it." Benoit emerged from behind the counter with a look of relief on his face. He walked over and hugged me, beating his hand on my back so firmly it knocked the air out of my lungs a little. "Take it easy. You'll break a rib," I said, laughing a little. "Sorry. Just good to see you," he replied, releasing me. "You hadn't called in a few days. I thought you might not make it." "I almost didn't. Something happened to me while I was on the road," I replied. I wanted to fill Benoit in on all the details of my trip, but I was more perplexed by the shop we were standing in. "Marie's? Who owns this place?" "Your sister," I inquired, puzzled. "It was my grandmother's. My sister is named after her. She died just after we were shipped out to Vietnam. My sister looked after the place while I was away. Almost as soon as I was home, she moved to LA. She has a notion to become a singer. My grandmother left her some money, and I got the creepy shop," Benoit said while sweeping his arm across the selection of weird merchandise in the shop. "And people buy this stuff," I said, pointing at an odd selection of herbs. "Business is good. The shop is kinda discreet, so the tourists think they've found some genuine secret voodoo shop. Don't worry, 95% of this stuff is completely harmless," Benoit said, smiling. "And the other 5%? I skeptically inquired. "Yeah, that stuff's not for tourists. I keep those items in the back storeroom, along with an item I got in the mail. Speaking of which, what happened to you on the road? Benoit walked over to the door and locked it. I filled Benoit in on the hospital in Japan, the statuette, and the woman at the motel. The only details I left out was the murder of the motel owner and the whispers. I didn't want to freak him out or involve him in a murder I might get accused of. Benoit listened, looking concerned. I got the same statuette in the mail. It was sent to my old address. Don't know how long it had been there. Probably since I got back from Vietnam. There's no way to know for sure. It had no postmark. Once I got it, I called you straight away. I got worried about the statuette, so I checked all the books here in the shop to see if any of them had any details on the statue or the woman in it, but I turned up nothing. Benoit continued. I was stumped, so I called the university at Baton Rouge. They pointed me in the direction of a retired professor, some expert in ancient religions, so I paid him a visit. He lives about an hour from here in the middle of nowhere. Nice house, but the land is practically a swamp. Did he recognize the statue? I asked on tenor hooks. Kinda. He said that it wasn't really African or American. The statuette is a crude modern replica, but the woman depicted was probably the Silent Mother, some ancient god people worshipped in coastal communities the world over, but her religion probably died away at least a millennia ago. Apparently she can grant her followers eternal bliss if they worship at her temple. Trouble is, no one knows where her temple is. According to the professor, it probably doesn't exist. He told me to give him a couple of days to do more research. Those people in the tunnel sure didn't look like they found eternal bliss. Then again, it didn't look like a temple either. Just a small shrine, I mused. And did he get back to you? And that was a couple of days ago. I rang him all morning, but he's not answering the phone. Benoit responded, "Aw shit, we gotta drive over there, now." "And bring a weapon," I said, putting on my jacket. "Should we just give him another day?" Benoit said, perplexed. "He may not have another day, Benoit," I said as we walked out the door. Benoit locked it behind him, setting the sign to closed. We drove out of the city to the west in Benoit's car. It was sweltering. In the tunnel in Vietnam. I thought you said you had seen something like that before. I probed Benoit. Well, I was embellishing a little. Look, when I was 14, a local counselor was accused of some pretty serious stuff. Several local women made some serious allegations about the guy. But he was white and powerful, and so was able to buy his way out of trouble. But the locals weren't satisfied with that outcome. One night, my grandmother drove me out to the middle of nowhere to a sort of ceremony. My memory of the event is kinda hazy. There were lots of people chanting, and there was this voodoo priest. They forced the counselor to drink this weird liquid. The counselor's eyes took on a kind of dead-eyed look, like the lights were on, but nobody was home. After that, the counselor responded to the shaman's every command: walk, smile, jump. He was like puppet, and then they just released him, and off he wandered into the night. The cops eventually found him and brought him home. According to newspaper reports, he seemed fine, if a little confused. He certainly didn't talk about any ceremony. A couple of days later, according to the same reports, he got a phone call at home. After the call, his wife saw him. He calmly walked into the kitchen, pick up a knife, and stab himself in the throat. Jesus. Fun story, Benoit. Way to lighten the mood, I said with a mental image in my head. So yeah, I didn't see exactly what we saw in the tunnels before, but I have seen some weirdly similar shit, Benoit said as he pressed down harder on the accelerator. We both sat in silence as he drove. After about an hour of driving, we turned off the small road onto an even smaller dirt track. Reeds grew high at the side of the road. The guy really did live in a swamp. Only a mile or so now, Benoit informed me as we bounced uncomfortably over the dirt road. As soon as he spoke, we saw a small column of smoke rising in the distance. Tell me that's not his house, I said, half hoping. His house is the only one on this road, Benoit replied with fear in his voice as we approached. The dirt track turned to gravel as we approached. It was a small old plantation house. Well, I say small. It was small as plantation houses go, but still imposing. It was also very much ablaze. Thick plumes of black smoke were bellowing from the house, but the fire had not fully engulfed it. The fire had clearly been started recently. The car came to a halt on the grass lawn. We both hopped out. Benoit ran to the front porch. There was a barrel of rainwater near a gutter pipe. He dunked his head into it, drenching himself. He pulled his soaked t-shirt up over his mouth and nose. "Are you fucking kidding? We're not going in there," I roared. "I'm not leaving the guy to burn to death. I got him into this mess." Benoit replied, his voice muffled by the t-shirt. I hesitated for a second and then, following Benoit's lead, dunked my head into the barrel. We both stood at the doorway, our faces covered, ready to enter. This isn't going to end well, I thought as Benoit kicked in the door. The heat was incredible. Smoke was filling the house. Luckily, those old houses had pretty high ceilings. The smoke sat like an ominous black blanket above our heads. Soon it would fill the house, and our lungs if we weren't careful. Benoit lead the way. His study is in the back. That's where he works. Benoit shouted through his t-shirt. We made our way quickly to the study. Benoit felt the door to check if it was hot. "It's warm. Keep to the side," Benoit said as he quickly kicked the door and then ducked to the left of the door frame. Luckily, there was no backdraft. The room was ablaze, but it hadn't burned up all the oxygen. Flames engulfed the ceiling and licked the walls. Then we spotted him. The professor lay dead in his chair, had slumped on his large wooden desk, a pool of blood pouring from his throat, and 2 shards of glass protruding from his eye sockets. Flames licked the walls, and the quilt of smoke rolled in thick black waves above our heads. Benoit and I stood over the body of the professor. We couldn't see each other's faces, but terror clearly showed in Benoit's eyes. "Check the drawers. I'll check his pockets," Benoit ordered. "What about prints?" I said in a panic. "Are you fucking kidding? In 5 minutes, there won't even be a body, let alone prints," Benoit screamed. Realizing my stupidity, I began to rifle through the desk drawers as Benoit took the unenviable task of checking the dead guy's pockets. The entire building was a sea of sound as we worked. The fire roared, and the building groaned under its own weight. "Rubbings," I said as I produced several thin sheets of paper from the desk drawer. I could barely make out the words with the smoke, but I saw the word "Silent Mother." For those of you young enough not to remember, this was how people used to copy shit before everyone had copy machine in their house. Be some of you are even young enough you barely know what a copy machine is. Benoit's eyes lit up at the sight of the papers. "We need to get out of here." Benoit didn't answer. The house gave out an unmerciful groan like a death rattle. It was doing the talking now, and neither of us needed to be told twice. We both sprinted for the front door as roof beams began to collapse. We sprinted straight to the car. I took one glance back at the house. It was almost engulfed. The roof sagged and collapsed in on itself as I hopped into the car. Benoit was already behind the wheel. The engine roared to life. We left a spray of mud and gravel as we tore off the lawn and down the driveway. The car bounced along the dirt track and we made it to the main road in double time. The house a raging inferno behind us. "The rubbings?" Benoit inquired. I pulled them from my pocket and examined them, scanning for anything that might be relevant. I could barely read the copied writing, my eyes stinging with smoke, but several blocks of text had been underlined with a red pen. I turned the papers over. On the back were some handwritten notes. I read one note aloud. "P.S. Mr. Benoit. It's worth pointing out that your statuette did appear to be hollow. Did you consider breaking it open? Perhaps you hadn't noticed, as you seemed afraid to touch it. I assure you it's perfectly safe from a historical point of view as it's a cheap modern replica. As to your question about the red house, please see my other notes." "The red house?" I questioned Benoit as he drove. "Look, I didn't want to freak you out, but I have been hearing voices telling me to go to the red house," Benoit explained. "I already knew you'd been hearing voices, Benoit. That creep of a psychiatrist told me at Camp Zema. I just didn't know you were hearing the exact same voice as me. No more secrets from here on out." I said angrily. All right, no more secrets from here on out. Benoit agreed. Oh, that nice motel owner I told you about. He was actually murdered in a similar fashion to our professor friend back there, I said, waiting for the backlash. Are you fucking kidding? You're bitching to me about secrets and you had a murder hidden under your hat. Benoit spat back at me with anger. All right. We're both agreed. No more secrets, I said while feigning reading the notes through my smoke-burnt eyes. We sat through the rest of the journey in silence. We arrived at the shop looking like shit. Benoit unlocked the door and we shuffled inside. Benoit made for the back room and I followed. The back room was large enough. It also had a restroom. I took the rubbings out of my pocket and put them aside on a desk for safety. We took turns splashing cold water into our burning red eyes, letting out sounds of relief as we did it. After a few minutes, I slumped down at a pillar exhausted. Benoit dried his hands and face, then threw the towel to me as he sat down at the desk to examine the papers. Benoit began to read aloud the underlined segments. The followers of the Silent Mother believed that she could offer them eternal bliss if they found her temple and released the silent plague. The chosen few who followed her would then control this world in her name. The unbelievers would be empty husks ready to be commanded, their souls captured for torment by the Silent Mother. Shit, that sounds all too familiar, I said. Benoit nodded thoughtfully as he skipped to another passage. The Silent Mother's temple, it is claimed, could only be found by locating 3 golden shrines to the Silent Mother dotted around the globe. These shrines themselves were claimed to hold some weaker power over mortals and could enslave unbelievers foolish enough to touch them, which the Silent Mother would entice them to do. Those who resisted the urge to touch the shrine would be rewarded with part of the location of her temple. It must be noted at this point that the shrines and the temple are believed by all reliable scholarly sources to be purely mythological. The only dissenting voice on this fact was a talented medical student named Arthur Blake, who traveled extensively in Northern Europe and East Africa studying the folklore in those regions during the mid-1930s. He claimed in a paper for a historical journal that he had found 2 of the shrines, and learned that the temple lay near a city by the sea fought over by all the great powers. He strongly believed that city was New Orleans. He refused to give any evidence why that city rather than many other cities that could match the given description. Suffice to say, his paper was roundly ridiculed for its vagueness, with many pointing out that no civilization spanned the diverse geographical areas he claimed to have found the shrines. Nor did it account for the fact that the stories of the Silent Mother's temple go back more than 1,000 years and no great powers fought over New Orleans until the 18th century. The student quickly retracted his paper, stating that while traveling for scholastic reasons, he had partaken in local rituals that involved psychedelics. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Benoit inquired, his hand shaking. Yeah, fate's a bitch. You've been living somewhere near a haunted temple your entire life, I replied. No, you idiot. That creepy fucking psychiatrist in Camp Zema, Benoit said, pointing at the papers. Oh shit. No wonder he's got such a hard-on for us. He's been searching for that 3rd shrine most of his life and we blew the shit out of it. Benoit began to read another one of the professor's handwritten notes. Although I was skeptical, I rang the Louisiana Historical Society, and there is a building that was once referred to as the Red House. It was an infamous brothel built in the bayou when New Orleans was first settled. The building has been abandoned since the 1920s, but has not been demolished as it is a protected historical structure. He has an address written here, Benoit said, looking over at me. That detail wasn't copied from a book. So, be our psychiatrist and his lady friend don't know the location yet. Unless they manage to torture the information out of the professor, I suggested. Why kill the professor and burn the house unless they already had all the information they needed? Otherwise they still needed us to find the temple, Benoit replied. Maybe he lied to them, or they just got sloppy. Hell, maybe we interrupted them when we arrived, I argued. We have to assume they either already know where the temple is, or are gonna follow us if we go looking for it, Benoit said, concerned. As we both pondered the subject, I spotted the statuette on a shelf. I picked it up with the towel, wrapped it into a ball, and smacked it against the top of the desk. I heard it shatter into pieces. This startled Benoit a little. Jesus, you could have warned me first. Benoit scolded me as I opened the towel, pouring the broken contents onto the desk. The broken contents emerged along with a small handwritten note. If you find the temple, destroy it. Don't let the followers of the Silent Mother release the plague. You've already destroyed one of her shrines. Finish the work and release the soul she torments. I guess more that one group has been following us, I said, confused. Alright, fuck this shit. We go to the temple and fuck it up. But I'm not going to that temple without some serious firepower, Benoit said with resolve in his voice. Do you know a guy? I inquired. Oh yeah, I know a guy, Benoit replied, pushing aside a storage closet to reveal a small door. Benoit opened the small hidden door. We both entered a small dark room. He reached up and pulled a cord. A flickering incandescent bulb suddenly illuminated what could only be described as an Aladdin's cave of armaments. Jesus, Benoit, when you said you knew a guy, I said, stopping as I marveled at the treasure trove. Yeah, well, remember when I said business was good? Well, this is the real business, Benoit informed me. I picked up and began inspecting an AK-47 style rifle from a collection leaning against the wall. Those are mostly AKMs, but there are a few Type 56s mixed in there as well, Benoit explained. I'm just disappointed you don't buy American, I said, laughing. Yeah, well, what can I say? Communists make reliable rifles. Although if you must insist, I do have something big, black and all American, if you want to see it, Benoit said, smirking. Christ, I think I've already seen enough of that in the showers at boot camp, Benoit, I said with a look of disdain. Benoit pulled the zipper open on a large kit bag on a table in the corner, revealing a large black M60 machine gun. Shit. Don't you think maybe that's overkill? Hauling it around might be a problem for little guys like us. What about ammo? I argued. Ammo in the issue. That's easy to source. The disintegrating belts that feed it are the problem. I only have one 50-round belt, Benoit informed me. No, we need to be able to move fast. It will only slow us down, I suggested. Good point. Alright, we'll leave it here, Benoit replied, stuffing to AKM rifles and for fully loaded magazines into a second empty kit bag. I took a single claymore that was sitting on a shelf looking lonely and put it into the bag along with the rifles. A claymore, Benoit said, surprised. Yeah, if we get there before them, I'd like to know when they arrive, I replied, smiling. Makes sense, Benoit agreed while placing some C4 and detonators into the bag. We all set, he said, zipping the bag shut. Looks like, I replied, as we both put on our jackets and checked our flashlights. I carried the bag. Benoit turned off the light and pushed the storage closet back into position, hiding the doorway to the small arsenal. We made our way to the front door. Benoit looked out onto the quiet street to see if the coast was clear. We're good to go, he said. As we both emerged, I loaded the bag into the trunk. Between all the time we spent reading a professor's notes and making up our makeshift arsenal, it was sundown by the time we left the city. I was driving. At Benoit's insistence, he said we were much less likely to be stopped by the cops with a white guy behind the wheel. The steering felt sluggish with the heavy cargo in the trunk. I drove slowly so as not to attract any unwanted attention. At a guess, looking at the map. The address seemed to be about an hour or so from the city, but it was deep into the swamp. We had to take a selection of back roads and by roads to get to our destination. Night was falling when we turned onto a small dirt road raised up from the water. Either side of the road was swampland. We drove on the road for a couple of miles. In the distance, a large building began to appear. The red house was, as the name suggested, red. It seemed to be made of sandstone. It sat on a small islet in the swamp connected to the raised road. It was a grand old building that looked more like a small fort that could have been lifted straight out of Paris or Saigon. As we got closer, it became obvious that the building was in a serious state of disrepair. But frankly, it was a miracle it was still standing in a swamp after all these years. I wondered if some unnatural power kept a structure like this standing in such an area, but I put the thought out of my mind and focused on the task at hand. Looks like we got here first, Benoit pondered, surveying the grounds as we approached. There were no other vehicles visible. Unless they arrived by boat, I suggested. The house was sat on the water and might have a jetty at the rear. It was hard to tell. The grounds were overgrown. We hid the car in a patch of overgrown reeds on the lawn. Benoit opened the trunk. I unzipped the bag and removed the 2 AKM rifles. I loaded a magazine into each and slung one rifle onto my shoulder and handed the other to Benoit. I stuffed the claymore into my large jacket pocket and we each took a spare magazine. The bag was now empty save for the C4 and detonators. Benoit zipped up the bag and slung it over his shoulder. We both walked up to the imposing building, weighed down with our armaments, and ascended the stone steps. The large wooden doors gave little resistance. I pushed them. We turned on the flashlights attached to our jackets as we entered a small lobby area with a coat room. I'm surprised junkies haven't taken this place over, I said to Benoit. People down south are afraid of buildings like this, man. Too many ghosts of the past. They stay well clear, he responded. We walked through the lobby area to a corridor. The air was hot and smelled of mold. The old wallpaper was falling off the walls, and bits of broken glass and other detritus littered the old baggy red carpet. At the end of the long corridor, we reached more large double doors. Opening them, we emerged into what looked like an auditorium. The room had a high ceiling and was laid out like a theater, with a stage and lots of booths and tables. The galleries had lots of private boxes. The place was all adorned with badly worn red velvet drapes. I guess the place was converted into one of those classy burlesque whorehouses, I suggested. Yeah, must have been pretty swanky in its heyday. I'm willing to bet rich folk and officers only. I can't imagine grunts like us would have been welcome in a place like this, Benoit responded. Yeah, well, back in those days, guys like you weren't welcome pretty much anywhere, I joked. Very funny. There's plenty of places we're still not welcome, he retorted. Where the hell do we go now? This doesn't look much like a temple, I wondered aloud. And then the familiar whispering voice began to speak. Welcome to Filers. I've been expecting you. Benoit looked at me in fear. I could tell we were hearing the same voice, and not just because she spoke in plural. The voice no longer seemed to be in our heads, it was emanating from behind the stage. We ran up and mounted the stage. The voice continued to whisper, but became louder. I put my rifle to my shoulder and pulled the charging handle. I parted the tattered stage curtain with the barrel of my rifle. The area was illuminated with our flashlights. We walked slowly through the backstage area as I darted the barrel of my rifle left and right at nothing but shadows. The voice whispered from below us. The floor was covered with an old rug. I pulled it aside to reveal a cellar hatch with a metal pull ring handle. I pulled the handle with one hand, the other tightly pressing the rifle to my shoulder. We were hit with a foul smell, like rotting flesh. Look, whatever we see or hear down there, we just ignore it. We plant the charges, and we get out as quickly as possible, Benoit said, fear painted on his face. I just nodded as we started to descend the narrow stone staircase. I suddenly remembered the claymore in my pocket. We paused as I took it from my pocket. I placed it on the top step pointing toward the hatch. I pulled the hatch down and attached the tripwire to the handle on the inside of the hatch. We continued down the narrow stone staircase. It looked all too familiar, like we were descending the same stone staircase. From the tunnel in Vietnam, it seemed to go on forever. I led the way with my rifle. It was hot. Sweat dripped from my face, and the smell of decay became overpowering. The stairwell ahead stopped at a corner and turned to wood. We rounded the corner. The wood was ornately carved like in a cathedral. We had clearly found our temple. The wooden corridor ended in an archway. We emerged into what looked like a small wooden chapel. The chapel was lit by wall torches and had a high vaulted ceiling. The entire structure was made of ornately carved wood. Only some unnatural power could keep this structure intact like this under a swamp. Even the foul smell subsided when we entered the chapel. The chapel was filled with wooden church pews, and paintings adorned the walls in perfect condition. Benoit and I stared in silence. The paintings depicted the woman from the statuette. In one she was smiling while handing bread to some children. In a second, she was comforting a sick, bed-ridden woman. In a third, she was protecting a group of peasants from soldiers in armor. At the front of the chapel, there was a large statue of the woman, but it wasn't gold. It was a simple wooden carving of the woman smiling. Aside from her legs being made of tentacles, she seemed warm and inviting. A small wooden box lay at her feet. The voice spoke. "Welcome to my temple, lost souls. You defiled one of my shrines. That shrine was a beacon to protect the weak and oppressed. Vulnerable souls will suffer because of your sacrilege." Her voice was warm and reassuring. "But all is not lost. You have found my temple and can repent for your sacrilege. You must help me feed the hungry, tend the sick, and restore the lame." "That's a lot of stuff, and neither of us are doctors," I replied like a scolded 5-year-old. "And I don't know anything about farming to grow food," Benoit told her in an equally ridiculous fashion. "Fear not, children. Simply open the box at my feet and read the prayer within, and my love will spread throughout the world. It will fill the stomachs of the hungry, heal the wounds of the sick, and soothe the minds of those in despair," the voice said in a reassuring mother's tone. I approached the box at her feet. Benoit followed me. I reached out to open the lid with joy in my heart. An explosion shook the chapel. The claymore at the foot of the staircase had clearly been detonated. I was disoriented for a second with the sound and shaking, just long enough to see the world as it really was. I retracted my hand. Benoit stepped back in fear, looking around the chapel. "This place, it's not right." Benoit's voice was filled with terror. "I know, plant the charges," I responded. Before my eyes, the wooden statue turned to solid gold, and the expression of warm comfort on the woman's face turned to malice. The ornately carved wooden pillars of the chapel turned to bone, and the paintings now depicted scenes of horror. In one, the woman hovered over an army of men with hollow eyes. In another, she stood before a temple made of human remains. The chapel pews turned to stone and were no longer empty. They were filled with the skeletal remains of people, all sitting upright, staring at the statue in adoration. The foul stench of something evil returned to my nostrils. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" I said with barely contained horror. "Yes." "Cover the door," Benoit screamed as he began planting the C4 behind the pillars. I could hear screaming from above us. Then 2 gunshots, and the screaming stopped. They had obviously put whoever had been hit by the claymore out of their misery. They clearly meant business. I could hear the footsteps of a large group of people descending the stone stairs above. "That sounds like a lot of people." "I knew we should have brought the M60, Benoit said in a hushed but angry tone. "Stop crying over spilled milk and plant those fucking charges," I said back, wishing we had the M60. I hungered down behind one of the stone pews with the AKM trained on the archway entrance, which I could now see was made of stone and human bones. I reverted into the mode of a trained soldier. My hand steadied on the weapon and my breathing slowed as I could hear the footsteps draw closer. A man entered the room pointing his rifle uneasily. He looked untrained. He certainly wasn't a mercenary. Maybe a fanatic. I didn't fire on him immediately, hoping his friends would join him. 2 more men entered. The third man clearly had some training, as he quickly spotted me hunkered behind the stone pew and raised his rifle. I fired 3 quick single shots, cutting each of them down. No more men entered, but I could hear people in the corridor whispering. "No grenades. You could damage the temple," I heard a woman whisper an order. I recognized her voice. It was the whore from the motel. Benoit ducked over and hunkered down beside me at the stone pew. "Charges are set. 10 minutes, he said, pointing his rifle at the doorway. I prayed it would be long enough. "I'm coming in. I'm unarmed. Don't shoot. I just want to talk," came a man's voice. "Okay, we can talk," I replied. It was the psychiatrist from Camp Zema. He walked in with his palms open to show he wasn't carrying weapons. "Thank you for leading us here. That old professor sent us on a wild goose chase. But we had some of our people tailing you as a precaution. I never imagined it would be this beautiful," he remarked, and all looking up at the ceiling. We let him talk, but we knew we were on the clock. "It's just as I had heard in the stories. A temple made of solid gold, he said while running his finger on a pillar near the entranceway. The pillar was made of stone and human femur bones. Benoit gave me a sideways look. I guess the Silent Mother promised different people different things. To soldiers weary of war are shown a perfect peaceful world, while the power-hungry are shown a temple of gold and promises of infinite power. This is the true gift of the Silent Mother. She can grant infinite wealth and the power to rule over the world. She can even restore her followers to life if they sacrifice themselves in her name. As he spoke, his eyes took on the same fanatic rage that I had seen before in the hospital. Yes, mother, not much time, I understand, he mumbled seemingly to himself. Then suddenly, he screamed like a banshee and ran toward us with what seemed like inhuman speed. The others waiting in the stairwell flooded into the room and began spraying assault rifle fire. I spotted 3 men and a woman from the motel in the chaos. We quickly cut the psychiatrist down, but the others seemed to be imbued with the same fanaticism. The Silent Mother was whispering to them all. Who knows what she was promising them? They were like animals advancing on us from behind the stone pews. Bullets snapped as they hit the pews we were hunkered behind. 2 of the men tried to advance too quickly, and Benoit put them down with a quick burst of automatic fire. I leaned out from the side of the pew and fired a quick shot at the crown of a head I could see poking up from behind. Another pew. A body slumped into the aisle. The woman had been flanking us and appeared at the side of our pew firing. A bullet snapped past my head. Then she was hit by a volley of automatic fire that cut into her legs. I turned to see Benoit's rifle, smoke emerging from the barrel. He ran over and kicked the pistol from her hand. We need to get out of here. We don't have much time, Benoit said, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. We were ready to leave when we heard the woman crawling along the ground. She was still alive and dragging herself by her fingernails toward the statue. We looked down at her. She was moving at a miserable pace, dragging herself inch by inch to the statue. It was still a distance away from her, and the attempt seemed worthless. Please, and Silent Mother, please, I sought out one of your shrines. I did what you asked, she pleaded, barely able to breathe, crawling slowly, leaving a snake of blood as her trail. Please do as you promised, restore my child's life. Please, Silent Mother, I beg you, she screamed with all her remaining strength through gritted teeth, crawling toward the statue. I pointed my rifle and shot her dead. We both ran toward the exit without speaking. The Silent Mother called to me while I ran. I assumed she did the same to Benoit. We ignored her. Perhaps her power was more effective on those who are desperate enough to believe her lies. We bounded up the stone staircase. The clock was against us. We reached the top of the staircase. The top of the step and the hatch had been blown away by the claymore. I crawled out over the rubble. Benoit followed. We sprinted through the auditorium. The ground shook and a loud thud rattled the building. It began to groan angrily, its foundations clearly shaken by the blast. As we sprinted through the corridor, the building began to list dangerously. The damn thing was falling into the swamp. We burst out the front doors of the lobby, down the steps and onto the lawn. From the safety of the lawn, we looked back at the red house. It was sinking on one corner backward into the swamp. Then suddenly, as if a support pillar had collapsed, half the building broke off and fell into the swamp. The rest soon followed as we looked on in silence. After that night, I never heard the whispers of the Silent Mother again, but I often thought of the desperation of that woman and what the Silent Mother had promised her. If you don't know what being particularly short during the Vietnam War entailed, let me fill you in. You arrive in country and a senior officer points at you and says you'd be a good fit for the tunnel commandos. Wanna join? Now technically, it's a question, as service in those platoons was voluntary. But it sure as shit didn't feel like a question, it felt like an order. And so that was my burden for the war, to be a tunnel rat, climbing down into deep, dank, dangerous tunnels filled with people and animals who wanted to kill me. Usually we operated in the huge Cu Chi tunnel complex near Saigon, but nah, on that day, we were ordered to investigate a tunnel complex way up north, west of Da Nang. 2 of us were sent into the tunnel that day, myself and Benoit. Now usually black guys manage to avoid becoming tunnel rats on account of them being so tall. But Benoit was burdened with the double misfortune of being short and black during the Vietnam War, a curse I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I was first into the hole and Benoit followed. We both had our Model 39s, some C4, our wits and not much else. If you're wondering why we carried the small caliber Model 39s, go fire a cold point for 5 in a narrow tunnel and come back to me. The last guy who tried that got a ticket home with blood pouring out of his ears. We crawled for what felt like an age. The tunnel was a tight fit, which meant it was probably freshly dug. It also stank something foul. That usually meant either spoiled food or some poor VC bastard died down there and was left to rot. After about 40 minutes of crawling in total silence, I saw the tunnel ahead open into a room. I tapped Benoit on the head with my foot. I heard him ready his pistol. I climbed down into the open chamber, pointing my pistol at the shadows. The room was dimly lit by a small oil lamp. It was also deserted. We took a moment to adjust. It was the longest single tunnel segment either of us had ever crawled through. It also had no traps, which was unusual. Where was everyone who dug the damn thing? Save for the lamp hanging from the roof and a canvas tarp on the opposite wall, the room was empty. I approached the tarp and used my pistol to move it aside. Behind the tarp was a stone staircase leading down. A stone staircase, this far underground. I whispered to Benoit, "VC didn't build this. This is old. Very old. Older than America old," Benoit whispered back with fear in his voice. "We've come this far. We have to keep going," I replied. We both walked slowly down the narrow staircase. Our flashlights had red lenses, and I swear the illuminated staircase looked like we were descending into hell. The staircase was almost as deep as the tunnel was long. Finally, I saw the staircase blocked by another tarp. Light was coming from the other side. I moved aside the tarp with my pistol. My finger trembled on the trigger. My eyes lit up. My heart raced. I almost pulled the trigger. But I didn't. Something made me pause. The room had at least 10 people in it, none of them armed. I pointed my pistol at the group and illuminated them with my flashlight. They didn't respond. They just stood there rocking gently forward and back. "Benoit, don't shoot. There's people in here. But there's something wrong with them." I stepped into the tiny room, which was lit only by small candles. Benoit followed. We both shone our flashlights at the people. They paid no attention. They continued to rock gently forward and back. I shone my flashlight in one of their faces. I clicked my fingers. She didn't respond. Her clothes told me she was VC. They were all VC. 3 women and 7 men, all gently rocking forward and back. Not a care in the fucking world. Their eyes were a solid color. Which color I can't really say, as I could only illuminated them with my red flashlight. Benoit motioned with his flashlight to the corner. Their rifles all sat in a pile. Badly rusted. Jesus Christ. Benoit, how long have these poor fuckers been down here? "I don't think Jesus Christ frequents this establishment," came Benoit's terrified response in his thick Cajun accent. I shone my light to the front of the room. The VC were all facing a small altar. I walked toward it. On the simple stone plinth stood a gold statue illuminated by several candles. The statue was ornately crafted. It was of a beautiful naked woman, the top half anyway. The bottom half was something like an octopus. Dozens of tiny gold tentacles had been meticulously crafted to woman's torso instead of legs. The statue had some writing at its base, writing I didn't recognize. I reached out to pick the statue up and take a better look, but Benoit shouted, "Stop. Don't touch it." I retracted my hand about an inch from the statue. "We need to leave this place quickly," Benoit said as he put his hand on my shoulder. "Are we just gonna leave them like this?" I said as I shone my light in their eyes. "We'll plant the C4 charges and put them on a 90-minute timer," he said. He was already removing the C4 from a pouch on his belt. "They're unarmed," I implored, turning to Benoit. "These people are dead. Maybe worse than dead. I saw something like this once. Before. At home in the bayou." I didn't argue any longer. We planted the C4 charges in a rush. set the timers for 90 minutes, and ran up the stone staircase as fast as we could. It felt like a lifetime till we reached the small room with the lamp. I climbed into the tunnel and Benoit followed. Suddenly we could hear a woman's voice faintly calling from far behind us. "Ignore it. Keep moving." Benoit shouted from behind me. I didn't need to be told. I wasn't going back. It was the longest crawl of my life. I saw daylight and kept crawling even though my hands were raw and blooded. I emerged into the light of day and gasped for fresh air. Benoit followed. We warned the others about the C4 charges, but told them nothing else. Benoit and I sat in total silence away from the tunnel entrance waiting, praying. The ground shook. A dull thud was heard and a spray of dirt emerged from the tunnel. We both breathed a sigh of relief. It is only after an experience like that you ask yourself the small questions. To this day I still ask myself, who the fuck was keeping the candles lit in that damn room? American troops during the Vietnam War often are attributed to the skillful tactics of its opponent and the lack of support on the home front. But U.S. forces were hampered by another stealthy enemy in Southeast Asia, vampires. From the beginning, combat in Vietnam's jungles presented new challenges for American troops. The Army in particular was trained and equipped for a conventional, mechanized war such as what they had faced in Europe, and Vietnam, with its jungle fighting, was a new game. The Viet Cong were masters of guerrilla warfare, during which they would hit troops with surprise attacks and then recede back into the jungle. They also effectively used small villages as bases and ammunition stores. In an attempt to turn the tables, the U.S. Marine Corps developed a Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, or CORDS, program, which assigned small units to patrol the villages. The Marines sought to recruit members of indigenous tribes in the mountainous region of West Vietnam to help them, but the Marines quickly discovered that the tribes were fearful of venturing into certain areas because of the presence of Ma, or phantoms. One tribe in particular, the Montagnard, spoke of reanimated corpses that haunted the jungle, drinking the blood and consuming the internal organs of people unlucky enough to cross their paths. U.S. commanders were quick to dismiss the claims as local superstition. Alas, it wasn't superstition at all. Reports of troop encounters with ghouls in the jungle began trickling into U.S. command around 1965. At first, the stories involved troops catching glimpses of ghostly figures moving through the jungle. Soldiers who saw these creatures described them as having fangs and black eyes. And then, soldiers began to disappear from their platoons. In one incident, two American soldiers rescued one of their comrades from a creature that appeared to be impervious to their bullets. U.S. commanders initially suspected vampires, as Vietnam, home to 41 known species of bats, had a history of outbreaks. One person infected in an isolated jungle villages with no access to vaccine could quickly spread the affliction through an entire community. Flamethrowers were key to vampire mop-up efforts during the Vietnam War. Strangely though, the undead creatures often appeared in the daylight hours, a feat thought impossible for vampires. One platoon of American troops found the entire village of Sun Hao occupied by these creatures. Despite the daylight hour, the embattled creatures managed to flee into the surrounding jungle, with troop morale plummeting and the Viet Cong making gains. Top Army brass brought several high-ranking FVZA agents to Saigon in the fall of 1966 for a consultation. The Army helicoptered the agents out to the village at Sun Hao, scene of the daytime battle between U.S. troops and the ghouls. Once there, the agents noticed that the triple canopy jungle was filtering almost all of the sunlight before it reached the ground. They speculated that this filtering was enabling the vampires to operate in daytime. In a report to President Lyndon B. Johnson, the FVZA concluded that eliminating the vampires would be virtually impossible in Vietnam's jungle settings. When Johnson read the conclusion, he famously said, "If the jungle's the problem, then let's get rid of the damn jungle." Thus began the infamous Vietnam herbicial warfare program. The military chose a defoliant, known as Agent Orange, and sprayed 20 million gallons of it over 6 million acres of jungle. Once the canopy was denuded, troops went into suspect villages with flamethrowers to exterminate any remaining vampires. The program was successful in clearing several large packs of vampires from the mountainous regions of Vietnam. However, many American soldiers and their Montagnard allies remained unwilling to go into the jungle villages. As a result, the Marine Corps abandoned the Corps program in 1968 and returned to a policy almost indistinguishable from the Army's. And Vietnam's jungles were left to the Viet Cong, the indigenous tribes, and the vampires. This story goes back about 30 years to when he was a soldier. His name is Uncle Mitter, and he is a friend of my father. He was sent to be stationed in the southern region, which was all dense forest. Deep within the forest, there was a village. Many soldiers were stationed there because the area required considerable oversight. The area required a significant number of personnel for guard duty and patrols. Consequently, many soldiers were stationed in the area. In a typical week, there were about 3 patrols in the forest, some during the day and some at night. Uncle Mitter mentioned that he enjoyed patrolling because it was less boring compared to guard duty at the post, especially since, at that time, there were no mobile phones or other forms of entertainment. At least during patrols, he could chat with friends and it felt like an engaging activity. One night, their commander received information from his contacts that there might be drug smugglers passing through their jurisdiction. The coordinates indicated a spot in the forest that the commander had never patrolled before. Normally, they followed familiar routes, but this time they had to venture further. They prepared and planned thoroughly for the mission that night, starting their patrol around 5 p.m. On that night, 12 soldiers, including the commander, were deployed for the patrol, significantly more than the usual 7 or 8. The larger number was to ensure they had the upper hand in case of a confrontation with armed smugglers. After driving to the edge of the forest, the 12 men, led by the commander and a few experienced sergeants skilled in navigation, began their patrol. Initially, the path was familiar, but after nearly an hour, they deviated into an unfamiliar, dense part of the forest as night fell. With only their flashlights to guide them, they navigated through the thick vegetation, consulting their maps as they went. They finally reached the reported spot and the commander ordered them to take positions, forming a circular formation to trap any incoming smugglers. Uncle Mitter, being the smallest, was assigned to a hill to signal if he saw any movement. After about an hour, he noticed flickering lights approaching and alerted the commander. The soldiers prepared to ambush, hidden behind trees and bushes, waiting silently as the lights drew closer, accompanied by the sound of footsteps crunching leaves. Uncle Mitter counted at least 4 or 5 lights, indicating a significant number of people. As the lights got within 10 meters, the commander signaled to strike. The soldiers revealed themselves, ready to confront the smugglers. But when they shone their flashlights, there was no one there, only trees and silence. The sudden disappearance baffled them, leaving the commander and his men questioning where the people had gone. If these people had run away, we would have heard the sound of them running. We even heard their footsteps when they were walking. There must have been some noise as they ran. If they had run off, they would have run straight into the circle of soldiers surrounding them. There's no way they could have just disappeared. Right. They should have been caught in the net we cast. With that many people, they couldn't have vanished into thin air. They couldn't have just dug into the ground and escaped. The soldiers closed in, expecting to meet the group, but instead, they found nothing. Captain was baffled. What the hell happened? He shouted up to Uncle Mitt, who was stationed on the hill. Hey, did you see anything? Uncle Mitt climbed down and reported, I didn't see anything. When they got close, the trees and bushes blocked my view. I saw them approaching, but then nothing. How could a group of people just disappear like that? They had multiple flashlights. Even if they ran, we should have at least seen them fleeing. Unless those people were very familiar with the area and knew all the escape routes, it's unlikely they could have gotten away so quickly. Initially, Uncle Mitt thought that might be the case. So, they regrouped and discussed the situation. It was around 9 p.m., and their mission was supposed to last until 2 a.m. If they didn't capture anyone by then, they were to withdraw from the forest immediately. With 5 hours left, they decided to change their strategy. Instead of forming a circle, they lined up in a straight line, staying close to each other. Captain ordered Uncle Mitt to keep his eyes peeled and not to let anything slip by. The plan was to wait and see if anyone else came by. If the group from earlier were locals who knew the area well, they might return. Uncle Mitt took his position again, determined not to miss anything. About an hour later, he saw lights flickering in the distance, coming from the same direction as before. He signaled to Captain, "They're coming from the same direction. I see lights again." Captain prepared the soldiers, positioning them as planned. They waited as the lights approached, getting closer just like before. This time, Captain wanted them to come as close as possible before making a move. When the lights were about 5 to 6 meters away, Captain gave the signal. The soldiers sprang into action, but they found nothing. This time, it was clear. It wasn't possible for the group to have run away without making any noise or leaving any trace. The area was dense with trees and vines. Even if they were experts at navigating the forest, there would have been some sound. Captain was frustrated. This is not normal. Where did they go? He shouted to Uncle Mitt, who was still on the hill. "Uncle Mitt, what did you see?" Uncle Mitt, clearly shaken, climbed down and explained, "When the group got close to you, I was watching them the whole time. Just as you and the soldiers made your move, they vanished. I saw it with my own eyes. They didn't run. They just disappeared in a blink." Everyone was on edge, unsure of what was happening. Captain knew they couldn't continue the mission like this. With 4 hours left, they decided it was too dangerous to stay. Captain ordered a withdrawal. They would stay near their vehicles until dawn, then report back to base that they stayed until 2 a.m. as planned. Before leaving, Captain made sure to count the soldiers. They lined up, 12 in total. Captain started the count, and as they went down the line, Uncle Mitt, who was last, counted 13. They counted again, and this time, Uncle Mitt counted 14. Each count added an extra person. Everyone was scared. Captain ordered Uncle Mitt to count from the back again. This time, Uncle Mitt started. 1. And they counted up the line, ending with Captain, and got 15. Each time they counted, the number kept increasing. They were terrified, knowing something was very wrong. The entire group had returned, with the last 2 buddies coming back after everyone else. "I found a gun lying over there," one soldier reported. "But I didn't see anyone around." The captain, visibly worried, ordered everyone to head to the spot where the gun was found. The 11 soldiers moved cautiously, sticking close together. When they reached the spot where the 2 soldiers had found the gun, the captain instructed, "Search the area thoroughly. Check every nook and cranny, every rock and tree." Everyone spread out, searching the vicinity. As they did, an eerie silence fell over the forest. They called out the missing soldier's name repeatedly, but there was no response. Suddenly, one of the soldiers, who was searching near a large rock, shouted, "I found him." The captain and the others rushed over. The missing soldier was perched high up in a tree, on a branch near the top, which seemed impossible to climb. The tree was straight and tall like a palm tree, with no branches low enough to climb. "How did he get up there?" someone asked in disbelief. The captain called up to the soldier, come down right now." But the soldier, visibly terrified, just shook his head and refused to move. His face was pale, and he seemed petrified with fear. For a moment, the soldier seemed to regain his senses, but then, without warning, he let go and plummeted to the ground. The impact was severe, his limbs were broken, and he lay on the ground, gasping for breath. "Quick, we need to get him to the hospital," the captain ordered. though none of them were trained medics. They made a makeshift stretcher and began the arduous trek back through the forest. As they moved, the weather turned worse. A heavy downpour started, making the ground slippery and the descent treacherous. They slipped and fell repeatedly, but the captain urged them on. They had to stop several times due to the rain and the difficulty of the terrain. They checked their surroundings and counted the soldiers repeatedly to ensure no one else had gone missing. Each time, the count was accurate until it wasn't. "Wait, count again," the captain said, sensing something was wrong. They counted once more and realized there was one extra person in their group. "Who are you?" the captain demanded, pointing to a figure that was standing with them but didn't seem familiar. The figure, wearing the same military gear as them but with a hat obscuring its face, didn't respond. The captain moved closer and tried to pull off the figure's hat. What he saw made him recoil in horror. The figure's face was missing from the nose up. It was just a bloody, gaping wound. "P retreat. Everyone, retreat," the captain yelled, his voice cracking with fear. They all turned and ran, some slipping and falling, but they managed to keep the stretcher steady and keep moving. They sprinted through the familiar path, no longer caring about the rain or the mud, driven only by the terror chasing them. When they finally reached their vehicles, they hurriedly loaded the injured soldier and sped off to the hospital. They counted themselves again at the vehicles, and this time they were only 11. They had made it, but the terror of what they had seen would haunt them forever. Shadows in the jungle. In the midst of the Vietnam War, a platoon of American soldiers is deployed on a reconnaissance mission deep into the dense, foreboding jungles of Southeast Asia. Lieutenant John Carter, a seasoned officer with a stoic demeanor, leads the squad. Their mission is to gather intelligence on enemy movements and report back to the command center. The soldiers are aware of the dangers that lie ahead, both human and supernatural. Before the journey begins, the soldiers gather around the campfire, sharing stories of eerie encounters and ghostly sightings told by the local Vietnamese villagers. These tales include spirits of the dead roaming the jungle, seeking vengeance, or simply lost in the afterlife. Private David Thompson, a young and impressionable soldier, listens intently, his imagination running wild with each story. The platoon sets off at dawn, the thick jungle canopy casting shadows that make the soldiers feel like they are being watched. The air is humid and filled with the sounds of wildlife, creating an ominous atmosphere. As they move deeper into the jungle, the soldiers notice an unsettling silence that seems to follow them, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. During the first night, the soldiers set up camp and take turns standing guard. Private Thompson, on his first watch, hears rustling in the underbrush and catches glimpses of shadowy figures flitting between the trees. Dismissing it as his imagination, he tries to focus on his duty. However, the feeling of being watched persists, and he can't shake the sense of dread. On the second day, the platoon stumbles upon an abandoned village. The eerie silence and decaying huts give the place an unsettling vibe. As they explore the area, they find signs of a violent struggle, scattered belongings, bullet holes, and blood stains. The soldiers feel a chill in the air, and Lieutenant Carter orders them to move on quickly. That night, the soldiers camp near a river, hoping the sound of running water will bring some comfort. As they sit around the fire, they hear distant whispers and see ghostly apparitions moving among the trees. The soldiers exchange nervous glances but try to brush it off. Thompson, however, is convinced that the spirits of the dead villagers are haunting them. During his watch, Thompson hears footsteps approaching the camp. He wakes Lieutenant Carter, who organizes a search. They find nothing, but the oppressive atmosphere leaves them all on edge. On the third day, the platoon encounters a squad of North Vietnamese soldiers. A firefight ensues, and both sides suffer casualties. The Americans manage to drive the enemy back, but the victory feels hollow. The jungle seems to close in around them, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. That night, as they bury their fallen comrades, The soldiers hear mournful wails echoing through the trees. Thompson swears he sees the spirits of their dead comrades standing among the trees, watching over them. The soldiers' morale is low, and even the stoic Lieutenant Carter looks troubled. On the fourth day, the platoon reaches a clearing where they find an old, crumbling temple. The locals had warned them about such places, claiming they were cursed and inhabited by vengeful spirits. Despite their fear, the soldiers decide to take shelter there for the night. As darkness falls, the soldiers hear strange noises coming from within the temple. The air grows cold, and an oppressive presence fills the clearing. Suddenly, ghostly figures emerge from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The soldiers open fire, but their bullets pass through the apparitions harmlessly. The ghosts advance, their faces twisted in anguish and rage. Thompson, paralyzed with fear, watches as one of the spirits reaches out to him. Just as the ghost is about to touch him, Lieutenant Carter steps forward, holding a crucifix he had found in the village. The ghost recoils, and the other spirits begin to fade. The next morning, the soldiers are exhausted and shaken. They gather their belongings and prepare to leave the temple. As they make their way back through the jungle, the oppressive atmosphere begins to lift. The soldiers feel a sense of relief, though the memories of their encounters with the supernatural will haunt them forever. When they finally return to their base, they report their findings to the command center. However, they leave out the details of their ghostly encounters, fearing disbelief and ridicule. The soldiers know that the jungle holds many secrets, both human and supernatural, and they are glad to have made it out alive. Years later, Thompson, now an old man, sits by a campfire with his grandchildren, telling them stories of his time in the war. He recounts the mission into the jungle, the firefight with the North Vietnamese soldiers, and the ghostly encounters that still give him nightmares. His grandchildren listen in awe and fear, their imaginations running wild, just as his did all those years ago. The jungle, with its dark shadows and eerie silence, remains a place of mystery and terror. The spirits of the dead still roam its depths, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander into their domain. In the dense, humid jungles of Vietnam, Lieutenant John Harris led a patrol of 30 soldiers on a search and destroy mission. The heat was oppressive, and the air was thick with the sounds of the jungle, creating an eerie backdrop to their cautious movements. Their mission was to traverse a well-known Viet Cong supply route and eliminate any enemy forces they encountered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the dense foliage, Harris and his men found themselves nearing the halfway point of their route. The men were on edge, their senses heightened by the growing darkness. It was then that they heard the unmistakable sound of movement ahead. Out of the gloom, a large contingent of Viet Cong soldiers emerged. Both sides were taken by surprise, and within moments, chaos erupted. Gunfire and explosions shattered the jungle's eerie silence. Harris quickly realized they were outnumbered and outgunned. Fall back, he shouted, trying to organize a retreat. The jungle became a labyrinth of death, with men falling on both sides. Harris fought valiantly, trying to cover his men as they attempted to pull back to a more defensible position. But the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. In the confusion, an explosion from a nearby grenade sent Harris flying through the air. He landed hard, the impact knocking him unconscious. When Harris finally regained consciousness, night had fallen completely. The jungle was dark and silent, save for the occasional distant gunfire and the rustle of nocturnal creatures. Groaning in pain, he pushed himself up and looked around. The scene was grim. Bodies of both American and Viet Cong soldiers lay strewn across the jungle floor, a testament to the brutal fight that had taken place. Disoriented and alone, Harris knew he had to make his way back to base. He gathered his strength and began to move, his every step a struggle. The darkness seemed to close in around him, and the once familiar jungle now felt like an alien landscape. As he stumbled through the underbrush, Harris heard a rustling behind him. Spinning around, he raised his rifle, his heart pounding. Out of the darkness stepped Private First Class Sam Davis, a member of his patrol. Harris felt a surge of relief. Sam. Thank God. I thought I was the only one left, Harris said, his voice shaking with exhaustion and emotion. Davis looked at him with an inscrutable expression. We've got to keep moving. Sir, the base isn't far. The two men moved through the jungle, with Davis leading the way. Harris followed, relying on the soldiers' apparent familiarity with the terrain. As they walked, Harris noticed that Davis was eerily silent, his movements almost too smooth, too quiet. The journey was arduous, with the jungle seeming to conspire against them at every turn. Strange noises filled the air, and Harris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times, he tried to engage Davis in conversation, but the soldiers' responses were curt and devoid of emotion. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the edge of the base camp. Harris could see the faint glow of lights through the trees and hear the distant hum of activity. Relief flooded over him. We made it, he said, turning to Davis, but Davis was gone, confused and unnerved. Harris stumbled into the camp. His appearance caused a stir, and medics quickly rushed to his aid. As they tended to his wounds, Harris recounted his ordeal, mentioning how Davis had led him back. One of the medics looked at him with a puzzled expression. Lieutenant, are you sure it was Davis? Of course, I'm sure. He was right there with me, Harris insisted. The medic shook his head slowly. Lieutenant, Davis was confirmed Kia in the initial firefight. We found his body hours ago. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. Exhaustion and disbelief clouded his mind. He looked back into the jungle, the darkness now seeming even more impenetrable and ominous. As the dawn broke, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that he had been guided by something beyond the realm of the living. Davis had saved his life, but the question remained, had it been a spectral apparition or the figment of a mind pushed to its limits? The mystery of that night lingered, but Harris never spoke of it again. The jungle had taken many lives, but perhaps, in some strange way, it had given one back. For the weeks following his return, Harris found it hard to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Davis' face, expressionless and silent, leading him through the thick, dark jungle. His fellow soldiers noticed his unease but knew better than to ask. They had all seen and experienced things that defied explanation. One night, unable to rest, Harris took a walk around the perimeter of the camp. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As he walked, he heard a faint whisper, carried on the wind. He stopped, straining to listen. It was a voice, barely audible, but unmistakable. John. His heart pounded as he turned, searching for the source of the voice. There, standing at the edge of the jungle, was the figure of Sam Davis. Harris blinked, his mind racing. The figure raised a hand, as if in farewell, before slowly fading into the shadows. Harris stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where Davis had been. He knew then that his friend had truly been with him, guiding him back to safety. Whatever had bound Davis' spirit to this world, it had finally found peace. From that night on, Harris felt a sense of calm. The jungle was still a place of danger and mystery, but he no longer feared it. He had seen the worst it had to offer and had come out the other side, thanks to the ghost of a friend who refused to leave him behind. As the war dragged on, Harris continued to lead his men with courage and determination. He never spoke of Davis again, but every time he ventured into the jungle, he carried a quiet confidence, knowing that he was never truly alone. The spirit of Sam Davis walked with him, a silent guardian in the darkness. And so, the legend of Lieutenant John Harris and the ghost of Sam Davis grew among the soldiers. It became a tale of bravery, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between comrades, even in death. The jungle might claim their bodies, but their spirits would always find a way to guide the living back to safety. The Haunted Outpost. In the dense, unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, Sergeant Mark Thompson led a patrol of 25 soldiers on a mission to reinforce an outpost that had been under heavy attack. The outpost, known as Echo Base, had been cut off from communications, and no one knew if anyone had survived the initial assault. As they made their way through the thick foliage, the tension among the men was palpable. The jungle was alive with sounds, making it difficult to distinguish between the ordinary and the ominous. Thompson pushed them forward, determined to reach Echo Base before nightfall. As they approached the base, the air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and decay. The sight that greeted them was grim. The base was eerily silent, with bodies of American and Viet Cong soldiers strewn across the compound. It was clear that the battle had been brutal and that no one had survived. "Set up a perimeter," Thompson ordered, his voice steady despite the grim scene. The men quickly got to work, securing the area and setting up defenses. They had been sent to reinforce the base, but now it was their responsibility to hold it. As darkness fell, an uneasy silence settled over Echo Base. The jungle's usual cacophony seemed muted, adding to the sense of foreboding. Thompson and his men took up their positions, ready for anything. But it wasn't the Viet Cong they had to worry about. Strange things began to happen as the night wore on. Private Jason Ramirez, on guard duty, swore he saw shadowy figures moving just beyond the perimeter, but when he investigated, there was nothing there. Corporal Steve Miller heard whispers in a language he didn't understand, seemingly coming from the walls of the command center. "Stay alert," Thompson warned. "This place is playing tricks on us." But the events grew more unsettling. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Radios picked up static and ghostly voices, and several men reported seeing apparitions of fallen comrades walking the grounds. The most disturbing sight was that of a lone figure standing at the edge of the jungle, always just out of clear view. One particularly harrowing incident occurred when Private Danny O'Brien, while on patrol, heard his name being called from the darkness. Thinking it was a comrade in distress, he ventured into the jungle, only to be found hours later, disoriented and mumbling about the voices that lured him away. The turning point came when Sergeant Thompson himself had an encounter. Late one night, he was reviewing maps in the command center when he felt a sudden chill. Looking up, he saw a ghostly figure of a soldier, uniform tattered and eyes hollow, standing at the entrance. The apparition raised a hand as if to salute, then vanished. Determined to understand what was happening, Thompson ordered a thorough search of the base. They discovered an old, abandoned bunker that had been overlooked. Inside, they found evidence of a previous battle, including personal effects of soldiers long dead. It was clear that Echo Base had a dark history that had been forgotten. One of the items they found was a journal belonging to a lieutenant named Daniel Harper. The entries detailed strange occurrences and hauntings that plagued the base during an earlier conflict. Harper wrote of men disappearing, ghostly apparitions, and an overwhelming sense of dread that haunted the soldiers. Armed with this knowledge, Thompson realized they had to confront whatever was haunting Echo Base. He ordered a small team to perform a proper burial for the remains they found in the bunker, hoping to lay the spirits to rest. That night, the air seemed lighter, and the oppressive feeling that had gripped the base began to lift. The ghostly apparitions grew less frequent, and the men felt a renewed sense of purpose. They fortified the base and prepared for the inevitable Viet Cong assault. When the attack came, it was fierce, but Thompson and his men held their ground. It was as if the spirits of the fallen soldiers were aiding them, guiding their hands and giving them strength. The enemy was repelled, and Echo Base remained in American hands. In the following weeks, the eerie events ceased entirely. The base, once a place of death and despair, became a symbol of resilience and determination. Sergeant Mark Thompson never forgot the haunting experiences, but he also understood the importance of honoring the fallen. Echo Base was eventually decommissioned, but the story of the haunted outpost became legend among the soldiers. It was a tale of bravery, supernatural encounters, and the unbreakable bond between comrades, living and dead. Group of mercenaries is hired for a secret mission in Europe. Their task is to infiltrate an abandoned Nazi bunker rumored to contain mysterious and powerful artifacts. The area is extremely dangerous, located on the borders of active war zones. The group of 8 mercenaries gathered in a dimly lit, smoke-filled room of an old tavern in the heart of a neutral European town. The atmosphere was tense, filled with the mixed sense of sweat, fear, and anticipation. The men sat around a worn wooden table, each one bearing the marks of their varied backgrounds and experiences. John Harris, the leader, broke the silence. "All right, men, we've got a job. High stakes, high rewards. We need to retrieve something from an old Nazi bunker deep in enemy territory." Viktor Petrov, a burly Russian, grunted. "What exactly are we looking for?" "A powerful artifact," John replied. "One that could change the course of the war. Our employer believes it's still hidden in that bunker." Pierre Dubois, the Frenchman, leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of skepticism. "And who exactly is our employer?" A tall, shadowy figure stepped forward from a dark corner of the room. It was their contact, known only as Mr. Black. He wore a long coat and a hat that obscured most of his face. "I represent interests that prefer to remain anonymous," Mr. Black said in a low, gravelly voice. "But rest assured, the payment will be substantial. You are to leave at dawn." He placed a large, leather-bound folder on the table. "All the details you need are in here. Maps, entry points, and the location of the artifact within the bunker." Klaus Muller, the German, reached for the folder but hesitated. "What's the catch?" Mr. Black's eyes, the only visible part of his face, seemed to pierce through each man in the room. "The bunker is said to be haunted. Soldiers who venture there never return. You'll need more than just firepower. You'll need courage and wits." Luke Harassi, the Italian, scoffed. "Ghost stories won't scare us. We're professionals." Finn O'Connor, the Irishman, nodded. "Aye, we've faced worse." Miguel Torres from Spain and Eric Svensson from Sweden remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Mr. Black smiled thinly. "Good. Remember, leave no traces and trust no one. The enemy is the least of your worries." As the men left the tavern to prepare for their mission, a sense of unease settled over them. The promise of wealth and glory was enticing, but the ominous warnings lingered in their minds. The next morning, the team assembled at the rendezvous point outside the town. Each man was fully geared, their weapons and supplies meticulously checked. The journey to the bunker was long and perilous, requiring them to navigate through treacherous terrain and avoid enemy patrols. John Harris took the lead, his keen eye scanning the surroundings. "Stay sharp, everyone. We can't afford any mistakes." The first day was uneventful, but the weight of the mission bore heavily on them. They camped in a secluded forest, setting up a perimeter to keep watch. The night was eerily quiet, save for the distant sounds of artillery and gunfire echoing through the air. As they huddled around a small fire, Klaus Muller shared a tale he'd heard about the bunker. "They say the spirits of fallen Nazi soldiers still guard the place, unwilling to let go of their twisted duty." Viktor Petrov shrugged. "Ghosts or not, we have a job to do. Let's get some rest. Tomorrow, we face the unknown." The men nodded in agreement, though the flickering flames cast shadows that seemed to dance and whisper, hinting at the horrors that awaited them in the haunted bunker. The next morning, the team set out early, their nerves steeled for the challenges ahead. The path grew rougher as they approached the outskirts of the enemy territory. The thick forest gradually gave way to desolate, war-torn landscapes, the scars of battle evident all around. By late afternoon, they finally reached the outskirts of the abandoned Nazi bunker. It was a massive, foreboding structure, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation and surrounded by crumbling remnants of barbed wire and fortifications. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. John Harris raised his hand, signaling the group to halt. "We made it. Keep your eyes open and stay close." The team spread out, forming a perimeter around the bunker entrance. Victor Petrov and Klaus Muller took the lead, cautiously approaching the heavy steel doors. With a groan, the doors creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. "All right, let's move in," John ordered, his voice low and steady. Inside, the bunker was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and dimly lit rooms. The walls were covered in peeling paint and old propaganda posters, remnants of a bygone era. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. Pierre Dubois, with his keen eye for detail, noticed strange symbols etched into the walls. These markings, they're not just for decoration. They might be part of some kind of ritual. Luca Rossi, always the skeptic, scoffed. "Rituals or not, let's find that artifact and get out of here." As they ventured deeper into the bunker, the atmosphere grew colder and more oppressive. Faint whispers seemed to echo through the corridors, making it hard to tell if they were real or just the product of overactive imaginations. In one of the larger chambers, they found an old, dusty crate marked with the Nazi insignia. Eric Svensson pried it open, revealing a collection of strange artifacts and documents. Among them was a small, intricately carved box. "This must be it," John said, carefully lifting the box. "Let's secure the area and set up camp for the night. We can't risk traveling in the dark." As dusk fell, the team fortified their position inside the bunker, setting up a makeshift camp in one of the larger rooms. They posted guards at the entrances, ensuring they would be alerted to any movement. The night was tense, filled with an unsettling quiet. Each man felt a growing sense of unease, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. The shadows seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on their minds. Around midnight, a chilling wind swept through the bunker, extinguishing their lanterns and plunging them into darkness. Strange noises echoed through the corridors, the creak of old metal, the faint sound of footsteps, and a distant, mournful wail. Miguel Torres, who was on guard duty, whispered to Finn O'Connor, "Did you hear that? It sounds like someone's walking around." Finn nodded, his face pale. "I don't like this. We need to be on high alert." Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence, coming from deep within the bunker. The team sprang to their feet, weapons at the ready. John Harris barked orders, trying to maintain control. "Everyone stay together. We need to find out what's happening." As they navigated the dark corridors, the sense of dread grew stronger. They stumbled upon a room that looked like a makeshift barracks, filled with old, rotting bunk beds. In the center of the room stood a spectral figure, dressed in a tattered Nazi uniform, its hollow eyes glowing with an eerie light. The ghostly figure raised a hand, pointing directly at them. A chill ran down their spines as it spoke in a hollow, echoing voice. "Leave this place. You are not welcome here." The team backed away, their courage wavering. Klaus Muller, shaken but resolute, fired his weapon at the apparition, but the bullets passed through it harmlessly. "We need to get out of here," Eric Svensson said, his voice trembling. John Harris nodded, his face grim. "We'll regroup and find another way out in the morning. For now, we hold our ground." They returned to their makeshift camp, the sense of foreboding stronger than ever. The night was filled with restless whispers and ghostly apparitions, haunting their every move. As dawn approached, they knew they had to make a decision. The mission had become far more dangerous than they had anticipated, and the line between the living and the dead had blurred in that cursed bunker. Day 3, deeper into the haunted bunker. The following morning, the team awoke with a renewed sense of determination despite the unnerving events of the previous night. They knew they had to delve deeper into the bunker to find the artifact and complete their mission. With their gear packed and weapons at the ready, they ventured further into the labyrinth and structure. As they navigated the dark, narrow corridors, the atmosphere grew heavier with each step. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to close in on them. Strange symbols and eerie markings adorned the passageways, adding to the sense of dread. Pierre Dubois led the way, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "We need to stay focused. Keep your eyes open for anything unusual." The team pressed on, their nerves frayed but their resolve unbroken. In the dim light, they discovered rooms filled with remnants of the past-old uniforms, rusted weapons, and faded photographs of soldiers long gone. Each discovery added to the oppressive weight of history that seemed to hang in the air. In one particularly dark and foreboding chamber, they found what appeared to be a command center. A large, ornate desk dominated the room, and behind it, an old map of Europe was pinned to the wall, marked with strategic points and battle lines. Eric Svensson's eyes were drawn to a dusty, leather-bound book on the desk. He carefully opened it, revealing handwritten notes and diagrams. This looks like a journal. It might tell us more about what happened here. As Eric read aloud, the team listened intently. The journal detailed the experiences of a Nazi officer who had been stationed at the bunker. His entries grew increasingly paranoid and frantic, describing strange occurrences and sightings of ghostly figures. The final entry spoke of an artifact of great power hidden deep within the bunker, and a warning to anyone who sought it. Luca Rossi scoffed, so they were afraid of ghosts too. Figures. Ignoring Luca's skepticism, John Harris turned to the team. We need to find that artifact and get out of here. Stay alert. As they ventured deeper, the corridors became more twisted and disorienting. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional distant rumble of artillery. They could feel eyes watching them, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. In a hidden alcove, they finally found what they had been searching for, a small, intricately carved box, covered in strange symbols. John carefully picked it up, a sense of unease washing over him. "We've got it," he said, his voice low. "Let's get out of here." The journey back to their extraction point was fraught with tension. As they retraced their steps, the bunker seemed even more sinister. Faint whispers and ghostly apparitions haunted their every move, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. As they neared the entrance, a sudden, chilling scream echoed through the corridors. The team spun around, weapons at the ready, but saw nothing. Their nerves were on edge, and fear gnawed at their resolve. They finally emerged from the bunker into the cold, gray light of dawn. The sense of relief was palpable, but their ordeal was far from over. They still had to make it to the extraction point, a journey that would take them through several war-torn battlefields. As they moved cautiously through the devastated landscape, the horrors of war were evident all around them: destroyed tanks, craters from artillery shells, and the remnants of once thriving villages. The team felt a growing sense of unease, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. As night fell, they set up a temporary camp, but their rest was short-lived. Ghostly figures appeared in the distance, flickering in and out of sight. The team could hear the faint sounds of battle gunfire, explosions, and the anguished cries of soldiers. Miguel Torres whispered to Finn O'Connor, "It's like the war never ended here. We're in the middle of a ghostly battlefield." Finn nodded, his face pale. "We need to keep moving. We can't stay here." The team pressed on, their journey fraught with peril. As they neared the extraction point, they encountered more ghostly apparitions, soldiers from different eras, locked in eternal combat. The air was thick with the stench of fear and death, and their nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Finally, they reached the extraction point, where their contact awaited with a sense of urgency. The team was exhausted and haunted by the horrors they had witnessed, but they had completed their mission. John Harris handed over the artifact, his hands trembling. "We did it, but at what cost?" As the team boarded the transport, they knew that the haunted memories of their journey would stay with them forever. The line between the living and the dead had blurred, and they had glimpsed the true horrors of war, both past and present. The haunting of Camp Alpha. Camp Alpha, located deep in the dense jungles of Vietnam, was established during the height of the Vietnam War. It was a strategic outpost, pivotal for its location, but notorious for the bloodshed that occurred there. Many battles were fought, and countless lives were lost, both Vietnamese and American. The camp's ruins now lay abandoned, overtaken by nature, but local legends say that the spirits of those who perished still haunt the area, seeking revenge or peace. Lieutenant James Harrison, a seasoned officer with a reputation for bravery, was chosen to lead a mission to survey Camp Alpha. The team included Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a no-nonsense veteran, Corporal Min Pham, a Vietnamese American with deep cultural ties to the land, and Private Sarah Collins, a young soldier eager to prove herself. Their objective was straightforward: assess the camp's structural integrity and determine its potential for future military use. The journey to Camp Alpha was treacherous. Dense foliage, hidden traps, and the ever-present threat of enemy forces made the trek perilous. The team's guide, a local named Tien, shared tales of the camp's haunted reputation as they traveled. Many soldiers died there, Tien warned. Their spirits do not rest. They wait for the living to join them. The team dismissed Tien's stories as mere superstition, but an air of unease settled over them. They arrived at Camp Alpha in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the dilapidated structures. The camp was eerily silent, the jungle around it unnaturally still. As night fell, the team set up their base near the old command center. The jungle's nocturnal sounds seemed louder here, amplified by the isolation and darkness. They gathered around a makeshift fire, the flickering flames casting ghostly shadows. Corporal Pham, sensing the tension, decided to lighten the mood with ghost stories. They say that those who die violently can't move on, he began. Here, in Camp Alpha, many soldiers met such fates. Their souls are trapped, reliving their final moments. Private Collins shivered despite the heat. Do you really believe in ghosts, Min? Pham shrugged. I believe in the power of this land. It has a memory, and sometimes it shares that memory with the living. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden chill in the air. The fire flickered, and a faint, anguished wail echoed through the camp. Sergeant Rodriguez, on first watch, gripped her rifle tightly. It's just the wind, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. But, as the night wore on, the sounds grew more distinct. Whispers, cries, and footsteps surrounded them, emanating from the darkness. Rodriguez spotted a figure at the edge of the clearing, a soldier in a tattered uniform, his eyes hollow and lifeless. She blinked, and he was gone. The next morning, Rodriguez shared her experience with the team. Lieutenant Harrison remained skeptical. We have a job to do. Focus on that, he ordered. They spent the day exploring the camp, documenting the decaying structures and taking photographs. The jungle had reclaimed much of the camp, vines and roots intertwining with the remnants of war. As they ventured deeper, they found an old bunker, partially collapsed and hidden by overgrowth. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the scent of mold and decay. They found old, blood-stained equipment and personal belongings, untouched since the war. A sense of dread hung over them as they realized they were standing in a tomb of memories and death. Private Collins picked up a rusted dog tag. This place feels like it's trapped in time, she whispered. As they exited the bunker, the temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick fog rolled in. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The team felt a presence watching them, following their every move. While attempting to find their way back to camp, they stumbled upon an old cemetery, hidden beneath the dense foliage. The graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, many of them broken and weathered. Corporal Pham knelt by one of the graves, reading the inscription. These are the soldiers who died here, he said. They were never given a proper burial. Rodriguez felt a hand on her shoulder and spun around, but no one was there. The air was thick with malevolence, and the ground seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. We need to leave, Harrison said, his voice tense. Now, as they made their way back to camp, the jungle seemed to close in around them. The wails turned into screams, and ghostly figures materialized, reaching out with skeletal hands. The team broke into a run, their hearts pounding with fear. Back at camp, they collapsed in exhaustion. The fog lifted, but the whispers remained. They knew they had to finish their mission, and leave before the hauntings grew more violent. Over the next few days, they worked quickly, avoiding the haunted areas as much as possible. The apparitions continued to appear, their cries for justice growing louder. Corporal Pham suggested performing a makeshift ritual to appease the spirits. They left offerings of food and incense at the cemetery, hoping to bring peace to the restless souls. On their last night, the jungle grew still. The whispers ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift. They felt a sense of calm, as if the spirits had accepted their presence. But as they prepared to leave, the ground trembled, and a chilling wind swept through the camp. Lieutenant Harrison stood at the edge of the clearing, looking back at Camp Alpha one last time. He could feel the weight of the haunted history, the lingering presence of the souls who had perished there. He knew that the ghosts of Camp Alpha would continue to haunt those who dared to disturb their rest. As the helicopter lifted off, the team breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had survived the haunting, but the memories of the cursed camp would stay with them forever. They had come face to face with the supernatural, and their experience at Camp Alpha would be a story they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Years later, Lieutenant Harrison, now a retired colonel, sat in his study, reflecting on the events at Camp Alpha. The haunting had left an indelible mark on him, shaping his understanding of the world and the thin veil between life and death. He often wondered about the spirits they had encountered. Were they at peace now, or still trapped in the echoes of war? He decided to write about his experiences, hoping to share the truth with the world. His book, The Haunting of Camp Alpha, became a bestseller, captivating readers with its vivid descriptions and haunting narrative. It sparked renewed interest in the paranormal, and many researchers and ghost hunters made their way to Vietnam, seeking to uncover the mysteries of the haunted camp. Years after their initial encounter, Harrison, Rodriguez, Pham, and Collins decided to return to Camp Alpha, accompanied by a team of paranormal investigators. The camp had remained untouched since their last visit, a forgotten relic of the past. As they stepped onto the familiar ground, the memories came flooding back. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. The investigators set up their equipment, eager to capture evidence of the supernatural. The team revisited the cemetery, now overgrown with vegetation. They performed another ritual, hoping to bring further peace to the spirits. As they chanted and burned incense, the air grew heavy, and a figure appeared, a soldier, his face serene and grateful. He nodded to them before fading away, leaving a sense of closure and peace. The story of Camp Alpha continued to inspire and terrify, a testament to the lingering impact of war and the resilience of the human spirit. Harrison's book was adapted into a documentary, bringing the haunting to a wider audience. The site became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the paranormal and the scars left by conflict. The spirits of Camp Alpha, once restless and vengeful, had found a measure of peace. The team's efforts to honor and remember the fallen had helped to heal old wounds and bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Even though the team had moved on with their lives, the haunting of Camp Alpha remained a defining moment in their careers. They had faced the unknown and survived, forever changed by their experiences. The jungle continued to whisper its secrets, and the spirits of Camp Alpha would always be a part of their story. As they looked to the future, they carried the lessons of the past with them, honoring the memories of those who had come before. The haunting of Camp Alpha was not just a ghost story, it was a reminder of the enduring power of memory, the need for closure, and the strength of the human spirit in the face of the unknown. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.